start. Hey everyone, it's Nathas, and today I'm going to be doing a spoiler stream with Scubatoad. Hey, how you doing, Scubatoad?
Oh, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So today is going to be a really fun discussion. So we're going to be talking about the state of the SolForge Fusion competitive meta, and then we're also going to be talking about kind of where we think the meta might be going with set four, and we're going to be spoiling a few cards. So I think this will be a really fun discussion, a really cool way for us to start thinking about where the future of SolForge might be.
Yep, it is something that I have really been just pondering myself as far as where the meta is exactly today, because it's had a bit of a long, windy road, especially kind of since your first Worlds event to where we are now. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, but I also think there's a lot of known variables out there. And I think it'll be exciting to just kind of like hash out where we've been, where we are, and then potentially where we're going.
Yeah, and I think that you're one of the people who I'm really excited to have this discussion with. Because not only are you a really great competitive player, but as the lead of Grey Viking Games, who helps provide some of the competitive decks to the scene, I think that a lot of the decks that we talk about, you will have had your hands on at some point, potentially have been selling it to everybody in the market. So you have kind of made this possible to even have a competitive meta. So I want to say thank you for that and for everything you do for the community before we really get into things.
Oh yeah, thanks. I do appreciate that, and I think likewise, I'm excited to have the discussion with you because you, I want to say, are kind of like the OG in defining some of the meta as it is and as it was when the game came out, and for the first year or so. And then I would say, I mean, you've been here over the past year or so, but I've definitely been a lot more involved in the meta, lately. And I think you've been here. I've seen you playing in some of the more competitive tournaments, but maybe less present as you've been historically.
Yeah, and
So I think
on
we should both bring two different perspectives in.
exactly, and that's something where I think that's cool for this discussion as well. Is I've not been as present as I have been in the past because I started a new job, I got a house, and it's just I haven't been able to play as much. So as we're talking about the competitive meta, I'll be able to kind of bring a little bit of perspective of where we were maybe like 6 months ago, a year ago. And Scubatoad, because you've been really active in a lot of these events that I might not have been able to participate in, you'll have like a really good boots on the ground view of kind of what's going on now. So I think that'll be just a really cool, fun way for us to look at these. So are you ready to kind of get into kind of where we think the meta is?
I'm ready.
All right. So this graphic that I'm about to put up on the screen, Scubatoad put this together, and I think it's an amazing way to kind of look at where the meta is, what's kind of dominant right now, and what's been kind of in terms of factions dominating the view. So I don't know if you want to get started because you're the one who put this together, and then we could kind of go from there.
Sure. I think it's only fair that I present it because otherwise I'd be putting words into your mouth. And so this was my take after reviewing the last few competitive tournaments I played in. And when I say the last few, for me that was pretty much, if you remember back, you ran a large Nathas circuit.
I did.
Um, and there was like, it was a bit of an invitational only, but there ended up being, I don't know, something like 30 participants, and it was an extremely competitive, any deck viable, including silver, etc. And then I've played in a handful of tournaments, recently taking second in the large Stoneblade tournament that they ran, which it was an interesting tournament because you couldn't bring in silver decks, so there's a lot that couldn't be brought into that, but also it was one of the largest prize supports that they'd offered.
I
So
know.
it was also kind of interesting because everybody brought out the best that they had that was non-silver, if that makes sense. And so that's my perspective mainly for where I put this together. And so I'll just break it down real quickly because I think it mostly speaks for itself. But from my perspective, the current meta, and to some degree where it's been, but I'm looking for Nathas to kind of keep me honest with, hey, whether this is new or this is where it's been, and we just get some slightly new takes. But effectively, you've got the big purple circle in the middle being Necrium, being really the main fuse partner for most competitive archetypes. And I've got 6 different archetypes on here that I roughly ordered 1 to 6 in terms of my perspective on the most dominant to least dominant. And I think I really want to at least take a little bit of time. I won't do it right now, but I want to talk about how a big part of, in my opinion, how these are out there is in terms of how not only how prevalent they are, but how easily they are to assemble a deck of that archetype and
Yes.
so I think number one, you've got Necria Mutera, life gain value. It can come in the form of AC3, AC4 Mantis Forge Seal, Krogius, as well as DFD, and also it just is it's one on its own. It's an archetype on its own, life gain value. There's just so much synergy between these two. Mostly it's all alpha, set one. And then from there, I put Rumble Spark in second, which is usually a Necrium. Help me out on red.
Tempest.
What is red? Tempest. Necrium Tempest Fuge, mostly focused on Rumble Spark being just an absolute value house that as long as you can flip it regularly, consistently, because it's level 3, it basically voids most removal. It is an absolute value house, and it's fairly easy to put together as long as you have a Nova Elementalist, which is,
Yes.
not crazy to put together. Then from there, I went to number 3, which is what I'm calling recursion value, which mostly focuses on the 4 big set 3 cards that I've been looking at, which is Hantu, Shambling Direhound, River of Souls, and Darkshaper Savant. Just a combination of recurring that stuff over and over and over again. Darkshaper Savant triggers, Hantu triggers, and just basically beating your opponent down with value. I put Scientists at number 4, which I think is a very debatable spot for that one. I know I just lost to it with Jed in the last event, but I've been testing with it a lot recently, and I think it has a lot of legs and actually matches up really well with a couple other of the large archetypes. And I think it just doesn't see a lot of play because of how hard those Aloyan lists are to find in set 1 that need to be paired with it, as well as how really difficult they are to pilot with all the recurring triggers with the Stitchers and whatnot, and just trying to figure out how to manage those boards, especially if you have a Pokémonster, Drick, a lot of these activates, etc. So anyways, that one's debatable. Number 5 is the Infinite Combo, which is mostly tabletop.
Yes.
You've got Summoning Mystical Stitcher, Blighted Circe, Dark Birth Mantis, General's Wrath, Indomitable Fiend. Those are 3 that you really don't see that often, and they're hard to pull off on the app, but I think they're a lot stronger if you're playing tabletop and you can just say, I did this 1,000 times. And then the last one being the Betrayer Soltor and Blighted Ironbeard. I don't know how often that is. I've never seen it played. I don't know if it's common or not. And then the last one I did was a honorable mention, Furious Shardback Archetype, because that deck has beat some of my top decks just out of nowhere with just Furious Shardback value house drawn at the right times, just clearing my board over and over again. So with that, you can see the card breakdowns that I put up here as a rough archetype, but that's my take. And I'm really curious from your perspective, what you agree with, what you disagree with on this meta breakdown.
So I think that this meta breakdown is very spot on to where I've seen the competitive meta and where I've kind of seen it go to a little bit from afar with the game over the last set or so, as I've been a little bit less present with my personal life, keeping me away from the game. So one thing I will say is that Necrium is dominant in the competitive meta, like in most cases, and we're going to actually go into a couple tournament results and look at some top 8s. Necrium is the driving force of competitive SolForge. It's something that we've felt kind of from early set 1, and it's something that I think is still true now, and something that I think is going to be true for a while until we start seeing some really big bombs come in some of the other colors. So I think that just have that big circle of Necrium in the middle is a great place to start when you're looking at the competitive meta, because it really carries a lot of your important decks. So the life gain value lists, I personally agree that that's at the top of the list, but I think it's a lot harder to find your top tier Army Commander 3, Krogius Mantis, your Forge Seal, Dark Forge Drains, all those decks that you have in this number 1. They're a little bit harder to play at the highest level, but I think that if you take your best life gain value deck against your best Rumble Spark deck, you're going to see a little bit more of a favoring on your life gain value. And we've seen that in results from the first and second worlds. We've seen that in a couple other major events. And it's something that I've kind of seen, even though a lot of people are bringing your Rumble Spark decks because they're very strong, very consistent, you can have a bad draw in your Rumble Spark deck and you might fall behind, where your life gain decks tend to be a little bit more consistent, get you more life, that get you to the late game, and then you just have these threats that will just continue to just destroy your opponent. So I think your life gain value in your Rumble Spark, they've been the number one and the number two since set 2 came out. And this is like the discussions I remember having with Mundungu and Cardboard Newt. Like, it's either RSC or life gain. Like, it's RSC or Mantis Krogius. And we did so much testing, and I think that's still the case right now, where you're going to be in your like Utera Necrium and then your Necrium Tempest. And something that I think is really important right now, that recursion value that you have at number 3. So I've only played against the Shambling Direhound deck once. And I remember seeing the Vampiric Direhound during Fuse Fest 2, but actually seeing it in one of the more recent events, I think it's a really, really solid deck. I think that being able to just like keep recurring your Shamblers, have a bunch of sack outlets to then refill your board with Shamblers. When you have a Hantu out to potentially deal extra damage, you have a River of Souls to reanimate your Shambling Direhounds. There's so many ways to just shamble your opponent to death, where it almost becomes a little more valuable to me than a Shambling Shambler. Because a Shambling Shambler was like my chase card when I was in set 1. Like, I was opening like pack after pack after pack, disappointed that I wasn't hitting as many Shambling Shamblers as I wanted, where I think that Shambling Direhound might be the new Shambling Shambler for me. And by that I mean it's like the card that's going to really just eat away your opponent's life, get you so much advantage, and then the fact that you could just chain your Shambling or Direhounds to fill up your board, and then you could like potentially have multiple sack outlets and then like set up a way where your whole board's going to die and you might be dealing like 6 damage, gaining 6 life per creature. You could do some really crazy things on that Shambling Direhound path. So I think, though, where I start to verge a little bit is at number 4. I'm not as big on the Scientist list yet, but I haven't really played against it yet myself either. But I know I've been playing against a lot of just like some of the top tier Loin lists, and I agree with you that it's really hard to find your like really, really good Alolan list that will be competitively viable. But when you do, and there's a couple that I think we're going to talk about a little bit later today, they can hold their own. But the most important thing is any deck that's not your life gain value list or your Rumble Spark deck, you need to be able to beat both of those lists to be able to even think about competing. And again, we're going to look a little bit at recent tournament results, but the numbers are pretty staggering of what people have been entering. And I think that it's just really difficult to find something that might be off of these archetypes to start like going in, unless it's like a really, really well-tuned list. So that's when you start seeing some really cool, like out of the blue decks that will just end up doing really well because they're tuned against your life gain lists and they're tuned against your Rumble Spark lists. I do think that Infinite Combo being a little bit lower at number 5 is important to note, because you can only do them on tabletop, and the game right now is kind of at first. So that Summoning Mystical Stitcher list ended up coming second in Worlds. Cade piloted it very well, but it's something that you are kind of fighting the timer for a lot of these Infinite Combo lists. One thing that I do want to mention is that the Blighted Cersei Dark Rebirth list that has been talked about a little bit, it actually doesn't work the way that people had thought, because it says destroy 2 reanimated creature. And unfortunately, you can't Dark Rebirth the Mantis that you've sacrificed. So I know this is something that's been a little bit of a hot topic on the Discords lately, and I think it's important to note that that one technically does not combo. If it did, I would probably be playing it as my number 1 list because I love Mantis.
I'm just out of curiosity, have you tested that in the app? Because ML Vambi got to the top 8 with it in the last event and was telling me he was looping it over and over again with the Soothing Mantis and was giving a creature +8/+8 over and over and over again. So I am just curious if you've tinkered with it or if it just doesn't work the way I thought it was, because I put it on here. I'd never piloted it before, but I was listening to him.
So the thing is, the way that people interpreted the rules made it sound like it should have worked. And it's something that I know I actually remember asking Fletch very early on when Dark Rebirth came out, because my first thing I always do when I'm looking at a competitive list is how can I break Mantis and Forge Seal more than I already have. And specifically, the way that they changed the ruling for 2, you have to have a target before you actually can use your ability. So then that's something that Fletch mentioned to me a very long time ago. And then I double checked with him when I saw that deck was doing well. And he was like, oh no, like it was the way that the programming logic was in the app, it allowed it to happen. But he did confirm that they are actually fixing that in the app, and it's going to
Mm.
be something that all the cards that kind of have the two, so Blight Witch level 1 and 2, where it says destroy a creature to play a level 1 spell. Right now, you could technically destroy a creature with nothing in your hand and then get a shambling trigger. So that logic is something that they're going to be fixing in the client moving forward. So
Oh,
that,
interesting. So
yes.
you're saying technically a bug, and but not necessarily, because I don't think it was on their list of bugs for the last tournament. So,
No, because I think it's
uh,
just something that people hadn't thought about as much. And then ML Vamby, like I think it was very reasonable the way that he described the way that the triggers worked. And I know Gorgeous as well had some really good discussion points where he was like, technically you could target the card and then the card will remember the fact that it was targeted when it's in the discard pile or the banish pile. But what Fletch confirmed is that specifically for the ability of reanimate, it needs to be in the banish pile to be able to be targeted. So that's something where it was just like a very easy thing to rule that way. But Fletch did confirm, he's like, oh yeah, that's the way it's supposed to work, is it doesn't reanimate itself. If there was a way to kind of destroy the mantis in between the loop, then you could get it to work. But
got it.
unfortunately in this case it couldn't.
Okay,
Um,
well, thanks for clearing that up. I
yeah,
think that's important for everyone to know.
exactly, which is one of the things where it's like, I know when you sent this over, I was like, oh, we should potentially take this off, but I thought it was worth leaving it on just to make sure that anyone hears this is like, oh, okay, like this is why it seems like it should work, but this is why unfortunately it doesn't work that way. But I do think if it did, it would probably be the most consistent in the boogeyman of the format, because you would just have to get to a Dark Rebirth 3 Mantis in cycle 2, and then you just have an infinite life off a Soothing Mantis. And as long as you draw your Mantis and you flip your Blighted Circe, you just automatically win the game, unless you're playing against someone also playing that deck. So it's like, it makes sense why it wouldn't work, but I wish it did because I love abusing Mantis. But I will say I would put Furious Shardback probably like right below Rumble Spark and Recursion value. Like that would probably be my number 4. And it's just like your Spell Slinger value, Tempest, Necrium lists, or like, because like even like in Worlds, I know Solimer has a really good Furious Shardback list that's done really well, and it doesn't have Nova Elementalist, but it's like, I think a good Furious Shardback list is close to that top tier list, because you could just wipe your opponent's boards over and over and over again and just keep pushing value and damage. So I
So,
do. Oh, sorry. What were you gonna say?
well, I'm actually curious about both the red fuses. So Rumblespark and Furious Shardback are two fuses I have played very little of.
Yes.
Rumblespark a little bit, Furious Shardback I think zero. I don't think I've ever piloted a deck with Furious Shardback. I have played against it though to understand its strength. And my question to you, like I look at these two decks very similar. Rumblespark Energy being just Rumblespark itself being an absolute value house, recurring it over and over and over again, not necessarily breaking the game, but just that card on its own can be a 5 for 1, 6 for 1, 7, 10
Oh,
for 1 by the end
100%.
of the game, right? Like, and then Furious Shardback, I kind of look the same way. Like, if you ping that thing multiple times and it wipes their board twice, that thing's a 6 for 1, 7 for 1, 8 for 1. And but the thing about both these decks, and I'm curious because you've piloted them both a lot more than I have, is are they really that consistent? Like, if you miss Rumblespark or Nova Elementalist, or you miss Furious Shardback, because here's my thing about them: Nova Elementalist is quite rare. There's only a couple hundred of them in existence, and same with Furious Shardback. There's not that many of them, which
Yes.
means they're both often hard to find very clean, strong tunings of. Right. So my
Yes.
question is how often when you miss those cards are they really that consistent? I know they've performed well in tournaments. Oh, well, I don't know about Fury Shardback, but I know Rumblespark has performed well in tournaments. And my question to you is, are these archetypes ones that like are just a handful of decks that got the Rumblespark and the Fury Shardback and are also really strong lists? Because the thing about SolForge Fusion is even if that card is a 6, 7, 8 for 1, if you miss it cycle 1, which is not that uncommon, like, are you just dead?
That's a great question, and this is something that is so important for me when I'm deck building, no matter what archetype I'm playing. But I think that specifically because Rumble Spark and Furious Shardback as well are both very popular decks, they're ones that you see a little bit more often in the competitive meta. And I think that what takes a deck from good to great and what from great to like top tier is the fuse around it. So like I think that if you're going to be in a, let's say, a bronze event, let's start there, and you're going to be playing a Rumble Spark deck versus somebody else's Tempest Spellslinger deck, just because you have that Nova Elementalist and that Rumble Spark, I think that puts you a little bit of a tier ahead. Unless they have like a top tier non Rumble Spark Spellslinger Tempest Necrium list. But as soon as you start getting into like a world's level or like one of the like the competitive circuit level decks, the fuse around it is so critical. So I've got like I think like at least 7 or 8 Rumble Spark decks, but there's 2 or 3 I always gravitate to. There's one, it's only got 3 spells, but they're mostly removal, but then it's got multiple ways for me to play free spells. There's one that has a Faeria Shard back and a Rumble Spark, or sorry, and a Nova, and a bunch of removal and stuff like that. So that's a deck that I always really love. And then I have one as well that's got like a 5 spell Rumble Spark deck, and that's something that I can abuse with other free spell decks. So for me, it's like the deck that has the highest possible quality, where if you miss your Nova Elementalist or you miss your, let's say, Faeria Shard back or your Dark Heart Sorcerer, you need to have a way to win. You need to have like 3, 4, 5, 6 ways to win in your list, to make sure that your deck is going to be like top tier competitively viable. So like my deck that I brought to
I think that I just want to double click on that for 1 second, because I think a lot of people misrepresent that and say, I just open a Nova Elementalist, I mash this up with a Dark Heart Sorcerer, and I'm gonna compete. And then they miss their Nova Elementalist in turn 1, and they're like, never lucky like everybody else is.
Yes.
Right? Like, does that make sense? And I
Yes.
just think like that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the consistency needed to compete at the high level in SolForge Fusion.
Oh, I agree. And that's the thing where it's like consistency is key, and having backup plans or a fuse that like if you miss your cards that you'll still do well is like the most important thing for me when I'm building a fuse for any competitive event. So it's like I could have 2 decks that are amazing on their own, but I look at them together and I'm like, there's like 5 dead cards. Or if I draw these 5 together, I have a dead hand and then my momentum is lost. Like that's where, like for me, that's one of the reasons why I ended up opening so many lists, because I was just like, man, like I love the idea of trying to find the min max and get the best possible fuses out there. But specifically, like in Worlds, for example, I ran a Rumble Spark deck that was like, I would say very well tuned. But there was like a couple games where it's just like I ended up having like weird things where it's like I would start my first turn with like 5 removal spells, and then the next like turn I would go through and it would be just like 5 creatures, and it's like even a very well tuned Rumble Spark deck, because of the fact that you're like going very removal heavy, and like typically your whole plan is to like get your Rumble Spark out. It's almost, for me, a lot of times a decoy, because your opponents are going to spend so much effort dealing with your Rumble Spark that like that leaves you free to do everything else you possibly would want to do on the board. And I think that's why Rumble Spark is so hard to play against for a lot of people, is because you focus so much on trying to flip the Rumble Spark back. Or like when I'm playing against Rumble Spark, I want to keep the Rumble Spark alive, but in a way where I could block it and not take damage from it as much as I possibly can. So it's like one of those things where it's like very like there's a lot of nuance to playing against Rumble Spark, but then if they brick, like there is something that like you could really fall behind in that type of deck. Where in your life gain decks, like you could brick, but then you draw 4 life gain cards, and then you just keep gaining more and more and more life. So
yes,
I think that.
I think.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Go ahead. Okay, well, so I was going to say, so I want to segue that into my quick pitch on Scientists, because I know you said before the show, and I think even on the show, like, I don't know about Scientists. I don't know if it belongs on this list at all. And I would have been with you 2 weeks ago. And I know you might say, well, Aaron, you just lost to Jed in the last tournament. It's recency bias. And you might be right. But what I think is so important about the Scientist list is I actually think it preys upon the Rumble Spark, because those lists have minions for days and fill the board and chump for days, which effectively turns off the main Rumble Spark value portion of that deck, which I think is really, really important. I also think the Scientist decks, when they are extremely tuned, have just an incredible amount of synergy, like cross synergies between Necrium and Aloyan, that almost gets to the tier of the life gain. The thing that I want to just point out about the Scientist list, why I think it's on here, and I think the very well tuned ones, and I'll actually give a shout out to Casey Kidd and Core, because I went back and watched their list, their breakdown of the meta, I think right before set 3. So shout out to them. And they were talking about how well a tuned list is. And I think that's so important to the scientist list, because what I think a lot of people don't realize about set 1 Aloyan is how strong those lists can be with the right package of cards. I think most people just see, oh yeah, they got a bunch of bad rares, there's a bunch of bad commons, and most Aloyan decks are bad. They're not wrong there, but I think people don't give that color pairing credit when they have a very strong build. Like if you get a Drix, a Pokémancer, rallying, tech upgrades, suppressing, like if you get a strong roll, those, like suppressing is a crazy good keyword. Like that'll just pick off a Darkheart Sorcerer and play a body on the board in the same turn. So anyways, my big shout out to scientists is that those decks are just dripping with synergies across the board. Like if you go back and watch any of the YouTube videos of Jed piloting that deck, I mean, the amount of synergies happening there is incredible. And when you look at the Ghastly Renewals and the Stitchers being able to bring back rallying creatures, which are already value houses on their own, it gets really, really interesting. So anyways, that's my pitch for scientists. I know you probably still are a little bit skeptical. I know that I don't think they were prevalent at all in much of the tournaments you played in back in the day. They may not be relevant, but I do think it's important to call out. Jed, I think, has piloted the list twice recently in competitive events and done fairly well, and I think part of the reason is it preys on the Rumble Spark by just having a Gizmo or a mindless zombie sitting in that lane all day long.
I would say that I think you've convinced me a little bit to put that higher on my tier list with that. So that was a really good way to look at this list. And I think you make a really good point that that's a really good meta choice against your Rumble Spark decks, which right now is what a lot of people are bringing to these competitive events. Just the amount of value that you can get. And like, granted, I have not played against that list yet, and it's something that I need to really go back and watch some of the footage of this being played. But like, you're right. That does sound like there's just enough value to kind of keep your board alive and then start pushing damage. And then like Apocalypse or Drix have always been two of my favorite things to like really mess with, and getting so much value there. Like, all right, I think
I
you
will say
kind
give
of,
it a shot, but I say
yeah.
what you will likely run into is you will say, I don't quite have the scientist list, or I don't quite, or the Necrium list, or I don't quite have the Aloyan list. I think it is likely that you just don't have the list that brings it to the tier needed. It's that level of tuning, right? Because if you just put two scientist lists together, it's not going to cut it for the most part. They have to be top tier, and they have to be dripping in synergy for it to go off.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think that's something that's important to think about for really any deck that might be coming into the SolForge competitive meta, is that if you could get a fuse that's like just got so much synergy, that has just the right pairing of cards with a couple really good win conditions, like you can compete. And there's actually a couple decks that we're going to be looking into, and one of them, like I remember seeing this list and not being like super nervous to play against it, and I played against it in one of the events recently, and it blew me away. So that's one that I definitely want to make sure that we're going to focus on in a little bit. But like, I think there's a lot of just really, really like, it's just deck building is one of the most important parts about competitive play. It's like, it's probably about 50% of what you're going to do is if you bring the right fuse to the table.
Yep. Well, actually, and so one thing that I've recently heard some people talk about, and I think this isn't necessarily new to SolForge Fusion, is kind of the idea of pay to win, and I think it's a topic all on its own. But I do think that the lists are so incredibly important, and I think on the one hand, sure, like the more decks you open or the more decks you buy, the more options you're going to have, potentially the higher tiered pairings that you have. But what I will say on the opposite spectrum is there is, I think, still a fair amount of brewing, counter brewing, meta-dependent lists out there that because the whole thing that we don't talk about at all in this sheet that we have up that we're displaying here does not represent at all the betrayers and the fact that they can either create archetypes on their own and or break or like bring a scientist lists from like B tier to A tier, which is what I think Jed's betrayer was in that last scientist list he had. And so I just think like, while yes, like the more decks you have, and if there's a new player listening, I do think like, yes, the more decks you have, the more you spend on chasing decks, etc. Likely, the more consistent you're gonna be able to put together fuses, etc. But I think at the end of the day, there's more meta play and counterplay than more and brewing potential to do some unique stuff. Like, we didn't even get into it, but Rumblespark actually has some somewhat silver bullet cards, which I haven't really messed around with them that much, but I think to some degree they can turn off Rumblespark.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about set 4, that there's a new set, a new silver bullet coming out for life gain value, etc. So I think there's, anyways, from my perspective, I am not jaded. I'm curious from your perspective, Sam, but I'm not jaded on SolForge Fusion, the meta being completely solved. And even if it was, like, I love, and this is the last point I'll make, and then I'll drop the mic for a second. But like, I love the fact, even if it's a life gain value deck versus life gain value deck, I personally, as a competitor, still love the nuance there. It's like, okay, what are the other cards in the deck that they have access to? Do they have a Botanimate? Do they have Disian Siphon? Do they have hard removal Dreadbolt? Or are they only running a Necrovive? Like, to me, the additional fact that our lists cannot be fully curated is just still so much fun, even in the mirror matchups.
Oh yeah.
And I'm curious from your perspective, if you're like, like, I get so tired of running, because a lot of people say I get so tired of running life gain into life gain. You know, I queue up and I run into life gain value. It's so annoying. But I don't know. For me, I still just love getting in there and be like, okay, what is actually in their list? What are their haymakers? What's their removal? How are they going to win the game? And I still think there's so much nuance from deck list to deck list that makes this game so much fun to explore still.
Oh yeah. So I agree with you a lot there. And I think for me, something that's really important is like I do think that the meta right now for the competitive game is solved to an extent. But I think one of the reasons why it feels that way is because like the renown system is meant to like really take decks out of the competitive, like I don't want to say it, not marketplace, but the competitive environment. And I know that's something where with not as many events going on, but people are playing a lot in the queue, they're going to see a lot of the same decks over and over again as people are practicing and playing with them, where it's going to feel like you're almost over constrained with the same few decks more than they actually do exist. So that's one thing I think is important to look at right from the beginning. But for me, I love the fact that every deck is different and no two people are bringing the exact same list. Something I've been doing myself lately is I've been trying to not really look at other people's deck lists when I'm playing just like for fun and casually. And I try to play around everything that could possibly exist, which I know there's a lot of different cards and a lot of different variables that you could play against. But it's like, oh man, if they have a dribble in their list, like I want to make sure that I play around it. You know what I mean? And it's like one of those things where it's like, that's a way for me to challenge myself to be like, I don't know what's in their list, but I'm going to play like they have it because like that'll make me kind of think of every possible situation and I might find a line that I normally wouldn't find. So for me, that's something that I do every once in a while. But I do think when you get to the down like the most competitive games, when you could look at other people's lists, see what they're trying to do, and sometimes be like unexpectedly surprised where it's like, whoa, I did not see that in their list. And they did something really cool. And like a lot of times the games that I lose, I feel like I get the most out of. And I enjoy those because then I find something that my opponent did something really cool that I'm like, wow, now I'm inspired. Just like you're talking about with scientists, like hearing you talk about that inspired me to want to like watch those games and kind of see how that deck plays out a little bit more. I know just people talking about just the archetype in general, like I've just thrown together a couple lists that I was just like, oh, I just want to try some of these lists that I've had in my collection that I've never played before. But I think that like from a competitive scale, the meta does feel a little bit solved. And I think that hopefully set 4 will change that. And I know something that OzForge has been doing a really good job with is actually doing like more limited formats and ways for people to play other decks. And I think something that would help SolForge a lot is if we were to have like almost like a standard versus a modern where it's like, oh, like right now we're doing competitive with just set 4 or just sets 3 and 4, but there's also like the modern or your vintage that has all the sets available. That way you can kind of have tiers of play where in your like let's say Worlds 2026 they have the first 6 rounds are all set 3 and 4 or 5 and 6, whatever sets we're on at that point. And then there's also some rounds where it's like you could bring anything, like the top of the top. So you also have to have like good decks in more than one, and you have to be able to play more than one list. So I think stuff like that could be really interesting. That would help make the meta feel a little bit more um, like a little bit more variety. But I will say that right now, because people see these type of lists are very strong, your life gain value, your Rumble Spark, your recursion lists, a lot of people gravitate towards that because a lot of them are also easy to build. Because you're set one, there's so much life gain out there. You could
Yep.
kind of just say, hey, I'm going to take to a really good purple and Utera deck, and I'm going to put them together, and I'm going to have a deck that could somewhat compete. Or I'm going to take my Rumble Spark that I opened, I'm going to put it with a couple things that could flip it. I now have a deck that could compete. And it like you can win with some silver bullets. You could have some really strong turns. You could win a couple events that way. Um, and I think that's really important that people will see these and they're like, these are easy to build. But then you'll find that the decks that you could fuse together that just like really pair well, that like have a really good like target of what you're trying to do, those can then come out of nowhere and just like destroy events. And like the scientist list, if I looked at this before the event, I might not have been as impressed with it before the event from this past week. But like after seeing the decks that it beat, I'm like, whoa, I gotta look at this list a little bit more and see how it operates. So I think that's something that's really important, and that makes this game exciting. Is that people will see what's being played, and then they'll meta for it, or they'll kind of bring decks that will do well in that meta. And I think stuff like Soul Swap being able to just stop life gain and Rumble Spark is basically the what's keeping your life gain decks somewhat in control. I think that's like really important to having at least a somewhat balanced meta. But I do hope that as people get a little bit more inventive, we will see more archetypes on here and we'll see like more interesting lists in the competitive scene.
Yep. I think I aligned to all that. And I think I agree with you that I think the meta is, I don't think we're going to see like a bunch of net new brews come out that are like, whoa, we've never seen a robot list be competitive, right? Like, I think we're beyond some of that, at least where we're at currently with the card pool alpha through set 3. But I am interested, or I guess excited still that there's still some level of innovation going on. There are still new betrayers that will be found that turn on certain things, and so from that side, aspect, I'm always excited to go see a new tournament. And I also think people. This is my opinion. I don't know if everybody agree with this, but my opinion is that overall, I think the skill cap in this game is quite high. Being able to know what cards do, what cards play around. Because the thing is, and I think a lot of other card games, you kind of like, oh, I've seen that deck play, I know how it plays. But in this card game, there's going to be cards in that deck that you may not run into very often. And it's like, oh man, I've not seen a Leyline Vermin before. I didn't realize that that could turn off something of mine. And like, I need to play around that, or, and I
Yeah,
think that makes the skill cap in this game still incredibly high. And I think, not that this is a discussion on pay to win, but I actually think like, when I go and look at a tournament result, a tournament, and I'm looking at my pairings, I'm actually usually looking at my opponent more than I am the list in terms of, oh man,
me
how
too.
competitive is this going to be? Because sure, you can go out and buy a good list, but the pilot and knowing the nuance and how to optimize the synergies and or play around what I'm trying to do is very complex, I think, in this game.
Oh,
I
I
don't want to
agree.
overplay it, but I think the skill cap is still very high. And I think anybody who's out there saying, they just spent a bunch of money, bought 2 lists, and they're going to win every tournament from here on out is likely mistaken.
I agree with you there. I think skill is such a huge part of it. And I think that, like, for example, going into the first Worlds event, the reason why I was able to do well in a field of a lot of Rumble Sparks was because I practiced against those lists so many times. Like, till my fingers were bleeding basically because we played so many games. And it's like just knowing the little things that could get you an extra percentage point here and there. Like I've definitely played against people who didn't realize that you could silence a Rumble Spark. So I was playing with a Rumble Spark. They have the ability to get rid of it for the rest of the game and they just didn't see that line. And that's something where it's like I know it's been a lot more like out there now, but like when the deck first came out and a lot of people weren't playing it in the first few like Ultimate Championships, like I remember me and Mandungu were like, why isn't this in more Ultimate Championships right now? And the first few Ultimate Championships were going through, and it was like exclusively Life Gain. Where like Rumble Spark is the boogeyman. Like it's going to be the thing that overtakes Life Gain, or it has the ability to. And then like people started playing it more, and then Worlds there was at least like 5 or 6, if not more, at the first Worlds, and it's like it's just one of those things where like it's just so strong, but at the same time, if you know how to play against it, you have a chance. But if you don't have those games under your belt, it might be a lot harder, especially if you're playing against someone who has a lot of experience piloting the deck. Because it's like there'll be times where it's like I'll flip my Rumble Spark and I know that I'm not trying to deal damage with it, and it's all about having my opponent try to remove it so then I can have my other threat stay on the board. Because I'm like, I could flip this again eventually, but it's like it's just knowing the lines of like what you want your opponent to focus on and where you think that you could push the most damage and get the most advantage. A lot of times, like I find that it's like those are the kind of things that could put something over the edge. Where it's like, hey, two people are piloting the same deck, they play it a little differently, and then one could have a much stronger result just because they like see these lines that could just really help to just push more damage and get more advantage and kind of like use your opponent's resources against them where they're spending more time chump blocking or putting stuff out that will die to your removal. And it's like sometimes I'll play my Dark Heart first, so they kill it. And I know that's kind of crazy sometimes, but then I might have another card in my hand that's a little bit more important in that situation of the game. And it's like little things like that I think are very important when you're playing your top tier competitive lists, where it's like you have to know your opponent and how they play. Sometimes they're very aggressive and you have to use that to your advantage. Sometimes they'll be very conservative and you have to use that to your advantage. So I agree with you. It's like the first thing I do is look at my opponent when I'm looking at a competitive game. So actually, one thing, first of all, because I realized that I wasn't looking at the chat at all, because usually when I'm streaming on Twitch, I'm not literally looking at the chat. But one thing that a couple people have mentioned was the prepared augment infinite. So it doesn't win the game outright. And I'm actually not familiar with this. So if someone wants to post in the chat what that means or what that ability or that combo is, I think that's something that we definitely want to kind of talk about a little bit before we move away from this discussion. But I know.
Wait, I missed it. So wait, there was a discussion of an additional combo that we missed and didn't put on the list.
I
Is that what
think
it was?
so. Yeah, it's called Prepared
Okay.
Augment. So Cade, the Puffin Man, mentioned that was like, I don't think we've seen anyone play it at a high level event, but it might be worth talking about the Prepared Augment Infinite, even though it doesn't win the game outright. So I'm very interested to see what this is, because this might be one that I'm just unaware of as well. So I think that would be really cool to see. So actually, here we go. It's Prepared Creature plus Mantis plus Steel Rosetta's Augment ability. So you use it on Mantis or Forge Seal. Interesting. So you basically have the ability to keep bringing or untapping Mantis, and you get the Steel Rosetta ability to. So augment, is that the one where you reanimate again? I forget off the top of my head.
I don't know augment off the top of my head. Prepared is where you deploy ready a creature, right?
Oh, augment is dupe dome effect. So that's basically you get to, I think, just reuse their deploy abilities, and then you will basically. So if you use your prepared creature, you basically ready it, so you get to keep activating your Mantis. So you do repeated deploy ability and give +X+X. It makes an infinitely large creature. That's sick. I did not know this existed.
Yeah, I didn't know that one existed either. So I'll add that. I'll add that. We can throw this up on the Discord for people to chat about, and I'll add that before we throw that up.
That's amazing. So actually, one other thing. So we have 2 spoilers today to go through. Do you think this would be a good time to go into one of those spoilers?
We probably should move forward.
I know.
You're right.
Mainly because we could talk about this for a while. Yeah. All right. So then the first spoiler that we're going to go into today is called Iceland Northwind. So let me get that on the screen right here. So this is our level 1 Iceland Northwind. So it's got 3 attack, 5 health. It's got mobility 1. It's a warrior, and it's got when this moves, give an adjacent creature +3 attack. So before we get into looking at the other levels, what's your thoughts on this one so far? If you just look at this at just in a vacuum at level 1, like, do you want this card?
No, I mean, not from a competitive list. I think in my head, I immediately compare it to Uranti Fire Seeker, right? Which is the one which I think is just activate at level. It's like a 3/6 in activate, give a creature level or +2 attack. And I think like this feels like the play pattern is almost identical because it's like mobility is effectively like activated. I actually think mobility is interesting because it's could be better or could be worse in that instance where it's like, okay, I'm going to activate it, but I have to be able to move it in order to get the buff, but also moving it sometimes is beneficial if that makes sense. But in a full board, you can't move it, thus you can't activate it. So I feel like it was maybe used as like Uranti Fire Seeker was maybe used as a balance tweak or, a balance benchmark for this card. Yes. And so, I mean, I don't think Uranti Fire Seeker is played in any competitive list. It's a card I actually quite like in like limited or whatnot. I'm trying to think if there's any way to abuse this. Not that I'm really aware of. Maybe you can find a way to ready it multiple times, but that's the same as Uranti Fire Seeker, so I don't think it's. And I think Uranti Fire Seeker is the card I'm thinking of. I sometimes get the names, but that's my rough like off the cuff perspective. I know you showed this right before it went off, and that was my thought of like, Uranti Fire Seeker. That's not a card that I'm excited to see in a list.
I get it. And yeah, this is one where I think it's very interesting. So one thing to clarify first. So the ability when this moves, give an adjacent creature +3, this is after the move is complete. So basically if you move from your center lane to the lane right next to it, and then there's a creature in the final lane on the right, this will give a buff to that creature. It's also just an adjacent creature, not all of your adjacent creatures, which when I initially read this, I'm like, oh, this is sick. You can move it. And then if there's like got multiple levels of mobility, you could potentially move it in between two creatures. And that's one thing that at least at level 1 doesn't show. And the stats here are a little bit lower to the point where like I think it's pretty easy to kill at 5 health, and it's not going to kill as much with +3 attack. That being said, though, being able to buff stuff is nice, and the fact that it's a warrior could mean a lot, because I know there's a lot of warrior synergy in set 1 and a lot of Utera warriors that this might feel nice in a deck with, where it's like, all right, I'll move stuff around, I'll give my Packmaster some extra attack, this will take some damage, and then it will get an additional attack. So you could find some interesting combos there. But I do think that the stats are not as high enough where I feel like this is like going to really make, at least at level 1, it might not be something that I want to prioritize in my hand right off the bat. But it's a very interesting card. I like the design, and I like the fact that it's a mobility matters, but it cares about where it lands, not the fact that it's moving, which I think is very interesting for me.
Yep, I agree. I think it's one of those ones where I'm not going to be disappointed to see it in my list, but I'm not going to be excited about it either.
Yeah, I agree. So then let's go look at level 2. So level 2 jumps to a 5/8. It's got mobility 2, and then when this moves, give an adjacent creature +5 attack. So I feel like at this point, your health is a little nicer, but at level 2, I feel like 8, it still dies to a lot of stuff, especially like when you're going against other level 2 creatures. But the fact that it has evasive abilities and it has mobility 2, I feel like you're going to find a lot of ways to kind of sneak damage with this card. And then giving 5 attack, it matches the amount of attack that it has, which is kind of interesting. So it's like, hey, it's got 5 attack, it's going to give 5 attack. So what are your thoughts on level 2? Do you like how it scales? Is this something that you're like, I don't know if I would want to drop this at level 2 if you had it in your hand? Like, where are your thoughts there?
I mean, 5/8 is not a terrible body. Warrior matters. Again, mobility 2 makes it, I think, a little bit more interesting, because that way it has a lot more flexibility to get to either side of the board. Because mobility 1 is a bit restrictive in terms of what it's able to actually get its buff onto. I mean, I think you have to give the buff at least once to get really a card's worth of value here.
Yes.
If you're putting this down and not moving it, and you're I don't know. I think most of the time you're going to be able to get the value, but even then, like +5 attack is a lot of attack and can be great in a hyper aggressive deck. But +5 attack is often just like, hey, they were going to trade anyways. Now they're still going to trade.
Yes.
Right. So I think this card has, and I do like that it has higher health. So I do think this card, an ideal situation, I think I think it's going to be awkward with the board states a lot of the time, but I think you're going to drop it somewhere. Move it to where you give the buff, and then be able to trade to where you kill them and you're still on the board, and then you can move it and give one more buff before it dies. I think at that point you may be getting slightly more than a card. Again, I'm mostly talking maybe sealed or some sort of limited format here, where you're looking at just trying to exchange resources. Yes. I don't think that's going to be competitive enough in a like a constructed event, but from a limited, I think you can actually potentially get more than a card's worth out of this if it's trading a couple times.
I think that's a great way to look at it. And also, now that I'm thinking about it too, like you could potentially augment onto this. And I know, like, for example, there's one augment that I think gives stealth, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like you could augment stealth onto this, move it around, and then potentially get a few extra turns of damage and additional attack. So like it's got like a low attack stat of 3 to 5. But like if you could augment onto it and get like either like some nice ability there, like it could potentially be like a good vessel for that.
Yeah, I will also call out that I just love this style of card. And you can move to the third level. But I would
Yeah.
just say I love the style of this card. Like as a player who is often looking to get as much of an edge as I can, these types of cards often have a play pattern that is not fairly intuitive. But it's like, okay, before I drop this, I need to be thinking about where my next creature may be, where this creature needs to be at. I have to have an open lane to get them to get the to get the buffs off. So I personally like this style of card, but I think to get the maximum value, it's a bit of a puzzle with the mobility and the
Yes.
fact that the adjacent creature gets it.
I think that's a great
I
way to look at it.
I will say I was slightly sad that this didn't buff both the adjacent creatures with mobility 3 with the idea that it
Yes.
could hop into a hole. I think that would have been a fun way to scale it. Maybe it's too strong or maybe they had to reduce the buff, but I don't know. Part of me thought this would have been a lot of fun at level 3 with the higher mobility level to jump it to a pocket and give both its neighbors. Anyways, that feels like a slight
Yes.
miss on the design, but still a cool card.
My guess is, oh, and first of all, it's an 8/12 with mobility 3, and when it moves, it gets an 8. The thing is, I could see that being too powerful. I think that if you can move in between two creatures and give both of them +8 attack, like they might have tested that and realized this is too strong for a common, and they might have actually geared it back. And that's something I
But
might have to
like
ask Fletch just to see.
leave
Like,
it at 5 then. Leave it at 5.
oh,
But
interesting.
you know what I mean? Leave it at 5 then and just give both so that you can. Anyways, I just feel like I like those when they start to get a little asymmetrical as the levels go up, personally. And I think that it makes the payoff a little bit more interesting when you could hop it into it or leave a gap for it and hop it in. I think it makes the player feel clever. So
It
I
does,
like
I
that
will say.
design slightly more.
Yes. And I do think that this is a card again where at level 3, like you can push a lot of damage with it by giving something else +8. But I agree with you that the skill of this card of like finding the puzzle of where to play it, how to keep a lane open for it. Like I think the fuse where this will be good is going to be a very interesting fuse where it's like you might have a lot of abilities to move creatures around or something where you're like Voltroning a lot of creatures where you're putting a lot of augments on them where then your lanes are kind of a little bit more clear. So I'm interested to see what a deck would look like that has this card in it. And then like there might be something where it's like you just draw a deck of like a Tempest deck with 10 cards where it's like, wow, like this supports so well. And it's something where it's like, if they don't kill this card, where it's like, honestly, the stats make it where it might not be their number one priority to kill right off the bat. Like at level 1, I think it was a 3/5, if I'm not mistaken. Like a lot of people will look at that 3/5 and be like, like I don't want to put resources into killing this. It's only 3 damage that I'll be taking each turn. But then you start moving it around, you're buffing all your other creatures, and they're like, crap, I need to use resources killing this instead of spending time killing other things that are a little bit more important. So I think this could actually, the more I think about it, like especially in sealed, this card can like really like
It's annoying. It'll be
yeah,
annoying to have on the field
exactly.
against you, I think. And it's just gonna be annoying because it's gonna be like, man, is it gonna start, especially off the forge? Like, where are they gonna move this to? Where are they gonna play? Is they gonna give them a profitable trade? So honestly, I think it's a really fun card. It's cool
Yes.
design. Well done, Stoneblade team.
See, I wish though at level 3, like you said, there was some asymmetric scaling where maybe it was like when this moves, give adjacent creature plus attack equal to its power or something like that. Where it's like if you buff this, you could have then gone crazy buffing your other things. But
Yeah.
again, I think again like, and I'm gonna ask Fletch to see if there was any like push design on this card that had to be pulled back, or if they were like, this is balanced enough where this makes sense.
Yeah,
So
or if I'm also curious on the design principles that they have. If they're like, man, we just don't like to do the asymmetrical design at set 3 because it means you got to read every card, all 3 levels of it at the start of each game to really understand what its effects are, to level it up, etc. So maybe they save those for more complex designs, and it's just like, we really like to like scale it up so that once people see it, they don't have to like make sure they're reading every level of the card. Anyways, maybe it's a design
yes.
principle they have too, and we're not giving them credit.
That's a good point. And one thing that I will say as well, so Rakdos Unleashed just commented, the art kind of bothers me. What's up with her leg? And now that I'm looking at it, I don't know where her leg is. It's somewhere like under her blade, but like it kind of melds into where the actual like the tiger is. And I will be posting the high res images of this art into the Discord like right after the stream. And I'm very curious actually, like what's going on
I
with the
see
leg
it
and the
now. Yeah, it is like her knee goes down, maybe to the. I think her knee just goes down. I think it just blends in. I think it's there. I think it just blends in. There's no
yes.
contrast between, or maybe it was intended to do that and kind of was the artist design. But yeah, it's kind of strange because it feels like it just disappears.
Yeah, then Iron Bryce actually just said the tire doesn't seem appropriate for riding a snow leopard. The chafing would be outrageous. Which, yeah, that's really funny. So we do actually still have one more spoiler that we're going to get to at the end of the stream. But do you want to get into a little bit of the competitive results of kind of where people
Yeah,
have been?
let's go through it. I think we've talked through a lot of it already, so I don't think it'll be. I think we can move through it fairly quickly.
Yes. So basically, what we did was we looked at 6 of the biggest, most recent tournaments. So there was Ankh had a Summer 24 Invitational. Osforge had their Season 0 Silver Qualifier. There was a November online Silver event run by Stoneblade. There was a Shadows over Solis Championship Series Qualifier, which came back in early February. There was a SolForge Fusion prize event, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the first SolForge Fusion big prize event, and then Worlds. So first of all, before we get into the results, one thing that I really want to mention is that SolForge has been doing a really good job of getting a little bit more monetary incentive for playing the game in terms of prizing. So, like, for example, the first Worlds, like, I got my card art, or I'm going to have my likeness on a card. I got an exclusive play mat, but, like, I didn't get any sealed product. I got a couple, like, decks and things like that. But then there's an online qualifier, which I think has, like, over $15,000 worth of prizing. And then there's going to be that, like, the leaderboard's going to, I think it's, like, over $100,000 worth of prizing. So it's, like, there's some, like, real monetary incentive for wanting to push competitive decks, which I think is going to start seeing, like, some really interesting competitive results where people are going to start bringing some real heat. So, like, there's a little bit of incentive to start playing a little bit more competitively, which kind of makes me excited. Like, what do you think about that from that aspect of things?
Oh, I think it really is interesting. I mean, I think that's what made that last tournament so interesting was it was arguably one of the largest prize purses of a tournament, but silver decks weren't allowed, which is kind of awkward, right? Because it's like, you know, you want people to level up their decks and, you know, and those are the decks that are competing in this. And I understand why Stoneblade did it, you know, because they want everybody to be able to participate. There's not that many silver decks out there, but it's left it in a bit of a strange spot because I think the higher the prize purses are going to bring out more competitive folks. They're going to be hunting for decks. They're going to be testing decks, etc. So it's interesting that it was a bronze event. I think a lot of people will be like, you're not facing those silver decks out there. But arguably, I don't know where your thoughts on this, but I think a lot of the older silver decks are maybe a bit antiquated to the lists that we're seeing today. And maybe there's one of the halves that's tuned, but the other isn't quite as tuned. And so I think it's left the game in a bit of a strange spot to be able to understand, well, what is really the premium event in terms of deck lists? And I think that's what you ran into when you did this analysis, is in terms of, well, like, yes, there's world championships, which have clout and some other things, but the prize purse wasn't there, so maybe there was not as much testing, etc., as there has been for some of these other events. So I think it's hard to know what the premier events are to be able to look at that and say, hey, this is the result we're going to use as a key marquee benchmark, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I think that's critical because, like, I know I have a lot of decks that are silver plus that might not hold up in the current meta, but it's like, again, there was a lot of events back in the early days of SolForge where a lot of stuff was pushing up in renown. So it's like, I think right now there's a lot of decks that are really strong that are just at bronze. So I think it kind of is a good way to limit some of the really, really strong early stuff is by having these events at bronze. Cause, like, I can't bring my Rumble Spark, like, list that I know is very well tuned that I've already silvered or golded because it's a bronze event. So it's like, I think it forces people to have to build more for making these, like, monetary events bronze, but I do think that we're going to have to start seeing some, like, very well pushed events that will be silver plus. And actually, one thing that I'm interested to see as well is will Worlds have a prize support similar to what they're doing for this online championship that's going to have, like, over $15,000 of prizing, if I'm not mistaken, because, like, I know that's the event that I'm going to focus on in terms of my competitive play, is the one where I could potentially win thousands of dollars versus, like, I know right now with buying a new house and all this stuff, I can't really afford flying out to Gen Con. So I don't know if I can make it to Worlds. But then if they announce, hey, with Worlds, we're going to have a $50,000 prize pool, which that's not announced. I'm just putting a hypothetical out there. Like, that might be enough for me to go buy a plane ticket. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think that is something that, like, definitely incentivizes people to participate more than they may or may not already, is when you have, hey, here's some money that you could potentially win in this. So that's one thing to definitely mention.
I think it's just good context. Anytime you're going to look at tournaments, I think that the prize purse as context is helpful. Helps you
100%.
benchmark, and I think it's just good context to set the stage before diving into this.
Yes. So of these 6 events, what I did was I kind of manually went through and looked at the top 8 of all of these. Like, and this is something that I'm happy to post if people care about, but I went through, here's the players, here's the placing, the archetype, and I try to very much simplify the archetype here, and then the deck list. So I kind of just like manually went through that from the top 8 of a lot of these major events. And if you look, so right now, of people who top aided out of these 6 events, there was 14 lists that were Rumble Spark. But something that's cool is there were 2 Tempest Utera ones, but 12 of them were Necrium Tempest. So like Boogeyman number 1 and 2 from our chart from before that Scubatoad put together, there's 14 lists that made it into top 8. Now, granted, I'm not looking into all the other lists that were played because some of these events had like 40 plus people, and I just didn't have the time to put that together right now. But that's something that I would love to see, kind of more stats of like, here's the full on tournament pool and here's what converted. But of the top 8s, there were 14 Rumble Sparks out of these 6 events. Now, life gain, you could kind of compare or combine the next 3 together. So there was 13 life gain that didn't have Mantis and Seal and didn't seem to be focused on your army commander or your Darkforge chain. So it might be like a Krogius list, or it might be just a really good Kindred life gain list. So there was 12 of them were Necrom Utera. There was 1 Tempest Utera that just like had a little bit of life gain synergy, so I dropped it in. From the Mantis Seal Darkforge drain, there's 2 Necrom Uteras, 1 Aloyan Utera, and then for your Mantis Seal army commanders, those are always going to be your Necrom Utera. So like your top 2 archetypes, and let me just close these again just for the summary. That's 33 of your 48 decks in the top 8 events. For the most recent 6 major events were basically your top 2 archetypes, which is kind of crazy to think about. That's really what's converting, but at the same time, that's what your stronger players who are potentially like very experienced might also just be using this as their like meta pick. So then at that point, it's like you got the strong player playing the strong deck in an archetype where they can be successful. So that's something that's really important to look at and say like, oh wow, like really those 2 archetypes that we discussed before. And I'm going to quickly put that chart back up on the screen for a second. Like your life gain value, your Rumble Spark energy, and then technically the recursion value. Those make up like probably at least 75%. Like I didn't do the math, but at least 75% of the decks that are converting into your top 8. Of that,
and the only sorry.
No, go for it.
Well, the only thing I was going to add to is I know I've done this. Somebody who wants to play in a tournament, but life is busy, and or maybe the purse isn't super high, that makes you do a lot of prep work and or brewing and or testing. And I would say my go-to in that scenario is like, oh, there's a tournament that's next week, but I haven't done much testing and I want to play or I'm gonna play. It's like that's my go-to. Like Necrium Utera life gain is my go-to, and in my case, I'm just pulling the top GVG lists that I can that can put that archetype together, and that's what I'll dust off because I know it's always going to compete. I know there's going to be a tremendous amount of natural synergy there. Rumble Spark, I think, is not that different, where it's like, I've got a Rumble Spark list that I've been interested in trying, and I've got a Dark Heart Sword. Like, I'm just going to mash those 2 together, and I know the value from Rumble Spark is going to carry me, especially if I can get it early in cycle 1. So I think that's also part of it, is just like those lists come together fairly easily and are almost always like in the ballpark of being competitive with a good draw, and I think that's part of it as well.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not diminishing how good those archetypes are, but I think that's part of how easy they are to put together and how consistently they perform.
I agree. And the thing is, people see that and then they also build that. So it's like, for example, like I know you sell a lot of decks to the community. Like I assume that the ones that have Rumble Spark in them and the ones that are life gain decks tend to be the ones that like really like are higher valued and then tend to fly off the shelves a little bit quicker on a new sale. Like, is that a reasonable assumption to make?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, honestly, I've done a lot of. We've sold over 1,000 decks to the community now, and I've done a lot of like Power BI analysis on what has sold, what was in the list, why it sold, and then actually used that data to go tweak the website that we run, which is SolForgeFusionDecks.com, to try to tweak the algorithm, adjust the decks based on what people are buying, what people are valuing, and I think it's not that great of data because I often don't know what the fuse partner is. That's the hard part about it. You know, like it's like I see one deck bought, but I don't know what they're fusing it with exactly or what they valued it. And so there can be some outliers in there of like, man, this deck down here sold. It's not that expensive, but it's like if they've got an interesting pairing with it, it can be different. So, anyways, from my perspective, I think yes, the Rumble Spark and Life Gains, there's almost always one or two of them that sell, and it's usually people critiquing those lists and or preparing for a tournament.
Yeah, which that makes complete sense. But the other cool thing when we're looking at this, so I guess before we look at some of the other decks on this list, of the 48 decks that made it into the top 8 of these events, 39 of them were Necreum in some case. So that graphic that again that you had Necreum in the middle, like very true to where people are looking at from a competitive aspect. And so far of the cards that I've seen spoiled from set 4, I feel like that trend is continuing. So that's something that I'm interested to kind of see how that evolves. But Tempest honestly has a good amount of lists, and Nuterra does as well. But like again, Necreum is just like very much like one of the very consistent pieces of your fuse if you're going to be in one of these top portions of the event. But then, for example, you'll see a couple Furious Shardbacks, which I'm pretty sure I saw Solomon was like me and who else, and I'm pretty sure both were you in 2 different events. So that's pretty funny. But then we got like a couple Omni decks. We have some Spellslinger. There was a double Nuada list, which is one of the ones that I've been referring to that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Cersei Soul Swap, which I think is an awesome like meta choice against life gain, where it's like you get to cycle 4, you're both life gaining, and then you just like change their life total with a small toughness creature. Like something like that can be just like a very big meta choice, which I've definitely lost games that I've just like been in a life gain mode because I couldn't kill them before they could soul swap me.
Can we pause there for 1 second?
Yeah.
I have never lost a Cersei Soul Swap, and I know when Set 3 came out, it was like, wow, that's the most powerful Forgeborn ability ever printed. That's going to be, like, just game over. And I have never once lost. I played a lot of SolForge, never once lost to a Cersei Soul Swap deck. And my question to you is this an archetype? Should it have been on my list? And or is just level 4 too late?
So the thing is, first of all, some people will play it with Mantis, which personally I've found not as much success with that because like your Mantis doesn't get as much value when you're trying to play Bones of Solace in cycle 1 and in cycle 2, but you could get an early Bones of Solace flip into your Blighted Cersei. So that's one thing where you could take that route. But I know there was a deck that I was playing a little bit less competitively, but on the queue a little bit. While I still had the Blighted Disintegrating Omni that I had, I paired that deck, which was a life gain green list with a Disintegrating Omni and a Disintegrate, with a Cersei Soul Swap deck that was very much looking to gain life, and it had a River of Souls. So my whole thing was, let's get to cycle 4. I'm going to reanimate my Omni and just like Soul Swap you and kill you as soon as we get to cycle 4, turn 1. Because I leave my River of Souls as long as I get to level 2, I could reanimate and just get a kill. And it's one of those things where I was inspired because I saw in a couple events a while ago that people were running Cersei Soul Swap with a red Omni, and just like again a way to just burn face as soon as you get to cycle 4 can be really strong. And I don't think people explore this enough, especially when you could potentially have a like a Dire Hound and like a River of Souls and a Hantu, and then if you pair it with just a really strong deck that could either gain you life or get you into cycle 4 or potentially cheat out the ability sooner. Like I've definitely like against Hellkite, I was playing and testing against him before I think that recent bronze event, and I was playing a life gain deck where it's like I was like over 100 life, and I was so nervous the whole game because I'm like, if I can't kill him before cycle 4, I'm likely gonna die. So then my whole game plan is I need to try to make sure that Bones of Solace doesn't flip, but then he's got ways to kill his own creatures. So it's like I think the deck, if you have the right fuse, and I don't think people are exploring it as much, I think if the meta is all life gain, your Cersei Soul Swaps could come in pretty big. That being said, that deck is not as good against your Rumble Spark decks, which are very aggressive. So it's like it goes into very well into 50% of the meta, and if you have the right deck, it potentially could go into like 75% of the meta. So it's definitely.
So would you honorable mention it? Would you have put it? You would have honorable mentioned it and put it on the main list?
I think so, but I think people haven't explored it enough competitively. So I think it's definitely an honorable mention that people could utilize, especially with some of the power level of set 3 Cersei decks and set 3 Necreum decks. So I think that's the case.
I mean, honestly, I've been wondering for a while because I have never once lost to it, and I've just been wondering for a while if it's a real deck or if it just doesn't. If it falls into the situation where there's actually not that many Blighted Circes out there, and then the amount of viable competitive lists that could even get you to to the fourth, you know, what are they called? Forgeborn cycles. You know, then it's like, is that really what's the cause here? Is that actually it's quite viable, but there's just not enough lists out there that have it. So, anyways, it's good to hear your take on it. Although, if I heard you correctly, it doesn't sound like you've actually lost much to it or seen it much at all.
So I've played against it from a few different people, but it's not very prevalent in the community. I would say that I definitely, before I got rid of my Disintegrating Omni Betrayer, like I played that deck a good amount in the queue because I was just like, I gotta give this a good send off, and it's like it was a lot of fun to play, and it like just had so much opportunity. Like no matter what the deck was, if you got to cycle 4, it's just like you had a silver bullet just to end the game. So I
Okay.
do think that it's something that like you have to have the right fuse, and like sometimes you might just have to get the right pairings in an event, because that's a big thing too, where it's like just getting paired against certain people. Like some people in an event might have an easier path through because they get paired against people where it's just like you're playing Rumble Spark and you get paired against decks that just are really good, like matchups where like your Rumble Spark will do well. So it's like I would say, first of all, let's say you do a good fuse, like don't get discouraged if you don't do well in one event, because like you might play in a second event and that's just like you might run well because like variance is a part of card games. You might run well, you might face it against opponents where you just have good matchups, and you might crush the next one. So that's something where it's like play testing is so important, because then you could kind of get a feel for your good games, your bad games, what decks you do well against. And then from there, it's like you might find that like one event you come in like 11th place, and the next event you win it with the exact same deck against the same people. So it's like that's something I think is important in the competitive circuit, is like don't feel down on the events or the results of one event. And also like the more you play your deck and the more you get to know it, the more opportunity you have to potentially just like do well with it.
Yep.
Um, yeah.
I think that's great advice. Bryce called it out too. I've actually pulled up the Twitch and can see the chat now,
Oh,
and Bryce
awesome.
called it. Bryce called it out that's great advice, and I think it is like variance is a thing in card games, and it's definitely a thing in SolForge. And I think it's great advice to say, hey, look, if you had a run bad or ran into a bad matchup or whatever, and you lost round 1, and it just set you up for the rest of the tournament, like that's just an unfortunate situation, but doesn't mean that you need to give up on the pairing.
Yeah, exactly. And I've definitely given up on some pairings too soon, and then I revisited them, and I'm like, whoa, this deck's pretty sick. And then like it's just one of those things where it's like sometimes even just a little bit of time away will give you a new perspective on how you play the deck.
Yep,
Yeah.
100% agree. I also see double rallying on this list, and I know we don't want to go super long here, but double rallying was the one I almost put up as an honorable mention with Aloyan. Oh, they have Aloyan Tempest here. I was actually thinking Aloyan Utera with just minion spam. I've seen
I might have wrote that wrong.
Mystical Mantis. Oh, okay. I
That
mean,
might have
it
been
might
my
be right. I
mistake.
don't know, but I would think Aloyan Utera with Mystical Mantis or something where you can create 3 wisps, we drop a couple double rallying creatures on top of rallying creatures, and you can build a fairly large board pretty quickly. So I didn't put it because I think double rallying in and of itself is a pretty tough deck to pull, and then if it's tuned at all is very tough. Like I've seen a handful of double rallying decks, and most of them are not tuned. So I think that archetype is definitely one that could exist, but it requires a lot of pieces to fall correctly.
It was Jed's deck, and it was Aloyum Necrium. I gave Tempest more credit than it deserved.
Oh,
Let me
okay. Oh,
fix
he's
that.
even calling you out in the.
No,
He's
no,
calling you out.
I just looked. He might have also said something, but that was definitely that was him.
He did, yeah.
Yep, and I looked at just double checked as well. So that was a typo on my end. So it was not
Okay.
Aloyan Tempest.
Well, either way, I was wrong still in terms of I would not have expected it to be Necrium as well. But as we know, Necrium is a house, has a lot of cards that can compete, so it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. But one other thing I want to mention, which I think is really cool to see as well. So obviously we had these 6 events that I went through. So I kind of looked to see which names kind of appeared more than once. So there was a handful of people who have top 8'd in multiple of these events. So first of all, Bryce, he top 8'd in 5 of these 6 events, which is really impressive. So I would have to look to see. I think they were all different lists as well, but that's a pretty cool accomplishment of the 6 major events that I've seen, either silver or big Stoneblade events. 5 out of 6 he top 8'd. Cade and Hellkite both came in with 3. Rusty, Solimer, Jed, Tony, Mr. Hot, and then Traveler all got 2 top 8s as well. So there's a lot of people who like top 8'd 1, but I just wanted to kind of do a little shout out to the people who have top 8'd multiple of these events, because that's like a pretty nice accomplishment to be like, hey, of these things that have been a little bit more of the competitive events these days, like top eighting in multiple events, it's just like it shows consistency, it shows skill, and Bryce, like 5 of them, that's pretty impressive. So that's really cool to see.
Yep, that is a list of people that I am not excited to be paired with in round one.
I agree. Yeah, and that's always a thing where it's like when you're paired against like a friend or someone who you know is like a really good player, like I always say like I want to face you at the end, or I want to face you like
Yeah.
in the top, but I don't want to face you in a win and in or things like that, because then it's like you always like want your friends to do well, and you want like people to be successful as well. So it's nice when it's like you kind of either don't play against your friends, even though it's always fun to play against them. It's like you don't want to have to like be that person who either blocks somebody or you got blocked by them and so on. So it's like that's always nice though. But again, 5 top 8s out of 6 of these major events is very impressive. And I think the only one he didn't top 8 was the one that he wasn't in the country for. So
Yeah.
that's exciting. Um,
Okay.
so, of these events, I pulled out some very like interesting lists or a list that won. So I don't know if you want to quickly go through a couple of those lists and just kind of and see kind of what makes them special, or maybe what makes them work in the meta right now.
Sure, let's pull a couple up. I'm
All
sure
right.
we'll go long. But let's pull a couple up at least and talk through them, especially if you
Oops.
have any that you're really excited about.
All right, so let's go back to that. I almost brought up the other spoilers that other people did so far that were key
Oh,
competitive ones.
that's
I
true.
didn't
Yeah, man,
show.
we still have that to go through
All
too. As
right, so
well.
we're
We got a
we're
lot
gonna
to
speed
cover
up. We're
still.
gonna speed up. So I apologize, everybody, because we've been talking for a while. We both know that we could talk forever. And we said that before this. We're like, we're gonna have an hour and a half cap, and we're getting close to that cap. So of these events, first of all, this is Hellkite's world's winning deck, which I remember being back and forth if I was going to use the whole like Dark Forge or Forge Seal Mantis Krogius combo, or if I was going to go more of the Dark Heart combo or Rumble Spark combo. And like I know he ended up going Forge Seal Mantis, and then as soon as I saw his deck and saw what he was playing, I'm like, man, I should have done the same thing, because again, a top tier list like this, like just can still win against your top tier Rumble Spark decks. And like he get triple Shambler with an Army Commander 4, and like just a really strong list that blanked out your Rumble Sparks. Like this deck was incredible. I'm sad that it's platinum, because like I can't play against it more in major events. But I think this deck is very deserving of winning worlds, and Hellkite's a great player. So this is one, obviously, that's one of the top tier decks of the list, and like so far, worlds has been won by Army Commander 4 Forge Seal Mantis. So we'll see what
Yeah,
happens this
we
year.
didn't get to talk about it either. Of like, if you went back, and you don't need to pull it up, but on my graphic, I called out the cards for each archetype, and Shambling and Shambling X and X Shambler were on there for almost all the archetypes, and it's just that card is just a beast. And 3 in a deck is, especially with the perfect Circe here, paired with the Forge Seal and Mantis, is just like, man, the amount of value that can be generated at all levels. It can put heavy pressure on early. It can trade successfully, and it's got these big haymakers it pulls at the end. Decks like this are incredibly scary to play.
Oh yeah, and actually, this deck came the purple half came from Fifth Cycle Matt. So he had this deck for the longest time, but he wasn't playing it with the Forge Seal Mantis route. And me and Hellkite were actually the two that were bidding back and forth. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this deck either sold for $250 or $350. And we were bidding back and forth, and both of us were like, "This is our max." And then he got there first, and I was like, "Man, it's gonna kill me to not get this deck, but I have to bow out." And then I remember he beat me with it in like the Swiss at Worlds, and I'm like, man, like I regret not pushing harder to get this list. But yeah, this is an awesome list, and it's always awesome to see Hellkite playing some really cool stuff. So this is one list that we just want to talk about. This is like the epitome of Forge Seal Mantis and like that archetype. And again, like so far it's won both Worlds events, so we'll see if that could be dethroned this upcoming year. Um, Here's the combo list that we're talking about. So Cade played this at Worlds as well. He came in second, and I remember watching that game, and like it came down to the fact that I think he just didn't draw the combo piece. So this deck is like a ticking time bomb, and like I know I played against him in Swiss, and he just destroyed me. Like he just comboed out in cycle 2, even though I had removal, even though I've tested against this type of list. There was just nothing I could do about it. And it's like a deck like this, it's great in paper. You can't really play it efficiently online because you have to do so many triggers. But like having your summoning Stitcher with your hematophagic Stitcher, and you just gain infinite life, there's just like most decks can't do anything after that unless you're playing a Soul Swap Circe. So that's another way that could come into the meta.
I
Um,
had thought about that. Yeah, that is interesting. Although I think they can also just kill you sometimes, right? With the loop.
yes, that too,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
especially if they
yeah,
have a Shambler. Um,
yeah.
Now this deck, this is one that Carl played, and I remember he was testing this earlier on in the meta, and like this is something that he messaged me about, and the two of us talked about a lot. One of the reasons I want to bring this up is this is a Dark Forge Drain deck, but it's Steel Rosetta with Oros, and he ran the Steel Rosetta because it had Inspire too. So the whole goal of this was to Dark Forge Drain on cycle 2. So you could basically, or Dark Forge Drain in cycle 2, and then use your Force Steel Mantis to Dark Forge Drain again. But then you have some really good Steel Rosetta abilities. And if I'm not mistaken, he had routes where he was able to like in cycle 2 with a higher up Mantis, or like go back and repurpose. Like he was able to basically repurpose and then use Mantis again multiple times. And I think that this might be the strongest Forge Steel Mantis Krogius deck that's in existence. This deck is really strong, and it's got Dark Forge Drain at 2, and like I remember he either opened it or bought it, and I was just like, man, like I'm jealous of this list, and it's probably one of the best lists out there. He doesn't play it as often, and I think that this specific green half could win worlds next year easily, if he has it
I'd
paired.
have to, yeah. If we had more time, I would sit and look at the Aloyan half and just be like, "Is this the optimal list?" But I know Electronex, Sonnet Burst, Warmonger Mod, Scipion Augmentation, all three of those cards are fantastic
Oh yeah,
spells. So again, I think it's a great scenario where it's like, hey, actually, maybe it is. Maybe Aloyan is the most optimal pairing with this, and the Aloyan deck looks fairly interesting, especially with the Terra Charger and a Pochymancer. So, anyways, I love to see Aloyan on here. I'd love to showcase a really strong Aloyan deck and how they can
yes.
be paired and do some unique and interesting things.
I just know that Betrayer Terra Charger just destroys in this deck. It's so good. Like this
The
deck
card is
with
underrated in
yeah.
general.
So I think this is one that on a future day, like I would love to see the two of you guys play, and he plays this against you, and you can kind of see it in action. So this deck is
I
so
have not
cool.
seen that one in action. Yeah, it looks
Um,
fun.
so in this deck, this is just an example of Rusty played this one, and he won one of the big prize events with this. And it's just your typical like really good for Rumble Spark deck. And one of the things that's important here, he had both a solid Cersei and a solid Sundra. I'm not sure which one he played, but it's important that you run a ton of removal and also have other ways to flip your Rumble Spark, as well as just have other threats on the board. So this deck is just he's won events with it. He's an amazing player, and he's done well at a lot of events. But this is one I just wanted to make sure we highlighted and said like this is a good example of a good RSC deck. Um,
Yep, I think it's great to have in this video archive. If you archive this somewhere, I think it's great, especially for newer players to come out here, take a look, and actually see what a strong deck looks like. Because I think even for me, I don't always know. Like, okay, I just opened an RSC. What do I pair it with? What am I looking for to see what it has in the half? I think a lot of people just don't know what a strong deck looks like. So I appreciate you putting these together.
yeah. And again, these are all from events that were recent. So within those like 6 events that were on that Excel sheet that I was showing, which I'm happy to post that as well for people who want to explore a little bit in that, like, and look at some of the events and what people had played. Um, Basically, here, this is what Jed ran against you actually in that event. So I don't know if you want to give the quick synopsis on this one.
I mean, I think it does exactly what I talked about earlier. That if you watch this deck perform, when I looked at Jed's list in the event and just thought, I'm not scared of that deck. I can beat that deck. I have way more value than that deck. And I did beat him once, pretty strongly. Although if you go back and watch that game, he did make a mistake in that game, I think. But anyways, this deck is it's a sum of all pieces. It doesn't have a ton of haymakers other than the Rallying Adept, which when paired with the Blight Witch, because he has minions for days, so he can anytime he lands that Blight Witch, he always has sacrifice targets, which means he's always playing his spells. The Scipion Experimentation was coming out of nowhere, where he gets free upgrades, he gets these free gizmos. His board is always full. And then the Dreadbolt, the Necrovive, are two fairly strong removals. So it's just, the Electronet, anyone who's played that card, is just annoying value card. So honestly, it's hard to say. I mean, Jed actually did a deck tech, so go watch that if you really want to know how this deck works. But it's just a sum of all pieces. It made me relook at Scientists, and the deck beat some of the strongest decks I've seen, recently competing. So go out, watch Jed's content. He produces fantastic content. He walks through exactly how this deck ticks if you're interested in seeing it.
Yeah, and this is again is a deck that I think is really exciting, and it's one of those things that like again a skilled player with a solid list. like they could come in and fight against the monsters of the meta. And looking at the chat, Jed did say every single card in that deck came in useful. So that's something where I know I'm excited to go watch through his playthroughs and his deck tech as well. But this is a deck that like you might look at it in face value, like you said, and be like, this is a cool list. And then you play against it, and I could see that being like, whoa, this deck's insane. So
Yeah,
that's really
you end up
exciting.
just like shaking about that rallying adept. You're just like, oh no, here it comes.
And the stats are solid too. 11-9 for free, and then giving everything +4/+4. Like, that's insane. That's really cool. So the next one is your list that you played in that same event, and I remember seeing this before the event, and we actually, I think we got paired in the
Yeah,
queue
you
right before
crushed
the
me.
event started. But that being said, though, I think that again, if we played 2 out of 3, like I could have gone either way. But your
So
deck is
here's the thing
insane.
about this deck. I think a lot of people look at this deck and just see, oh, it's life gain value. But what I didn't record my game, so you can't see it. But this deck can fill the graveyard with spells very early and can just win in cycle 2, turn 1, cycle 2, turn 2, like with just a couple large DFDs. It's actually how I beat Jed. I landed a large DFD on a swamp moss that I got for free, and then killed his creature that was in front of it with a Dreadbolt and hit him for 20, at which point my Shamblers finished him off over the course of the game. So it's just it's a deck that can put incredible pressure early on. It has a lot of life gain value. It's I think a scenario where it's typical life gain value, but thrown in with DFD as a haymaker at certain points in the game can put a lot of pressure on the opponent. So I just think it's an interesting list
I agree.
and a variation on what people often think of. A lot of people just be like, they're going to shamble you and whatnot, but it's actually a lot of it is about just putting pressure with DFD on early.
Yes, but a big thing is you have multiple win conditions here. So you have the shambling conditions. You've also got the Dark Forge Drain condition. So let's say you miss your Mantis and your Forge Seal a bunch, and you don't have a lot of spells in your yard. You could still play this as your typical life gain deck with just good removal. So it's like
Yes.
this is one of those decks that just has lots of pathways to win, which is what makes this a very strong
Yep.
list.
And which makes it good for tournament play because it's just going to be
Yes.
consistent every time.
I agree. And this is one that I'd love at some point to play against again because, again, I feel like I drew well that game that we played. And I feel like this is one that would be a very fun matchup to see how we would go. But your removal suite's great. And that's also another really important part that I didn't really mention in the competitive thing. So, I know we're talking a lot and we got to get to the last spoiler very shortly. But one thing that's really important is removal. Having the right balance of removal in a competitive scene is so critical because there'll be decks that I play with like less removal than what I feel like is necessary, and then you could just die to a threat that you just can't get rid of, and it's just
Yep.
removal's
And
key.
I'd even caveat that with hard removal, right? Like
Yeah,
when I look at a deck, like even in this game, when I'm pulling off these DFDs and I'm going to give something 16, 16, 18, 18, if they don't have very much hard removal, I'm just like, okay, well, I'm just going to keep building up this large breakthrough creature or whatever the case may be. And so I mean, I think I've underestimated Dreadbolt most of my SolForge career, and it's only now that I've really understood the power of just actual hard spot removal.
yes, it's literally like one of the first things I look at whenever I make a fuse is there removal and is there free things that I could do.
Yep.
All right, so the next one, actually, we'll save this one for last because I think this one's the more of the exciting ones. One other thing I want to mention: so Traveler played this list and won one of the, I think it was the Invitational for Osforge, and this list is really cool. Part of the reason why I wanted to highlight this is this red list. Actually, I'm 99% sure he got from Mundungu, and Mundungu, I remember, got this from one of the local players in his area, and he got this, I think, between Worlds 1 and Fuse Fest, and me and him played a couple games with this red half specifically, if it's the one I'm thinking of, during Fuse Fest. And then, like, I think he mentioned he got rid of it, so I think this has to be the same list. But it's really cool to see this in a list that's got Soul Gorger with Rumble Spark, double Rune Scarred Pit. Like, I like this fuse a lot. And the thing that's interesting here is there was no Darkheart Sorcerer, but this deck still ended up winning the event. So, like, you could have some really solid Darkheart Rumble Spark decks without a Darkheart. So this deck is really cool. It says the purple half is from Nathas. Did I trade this purple half? I must have. That's so funny. I didn't even remember that. That's great. So this is a
That
great
is
deck,
great.
and Traveler is becoming a really good player that I see a lot in the competitive scene as well. So that's really cool to see a deck that came from, I guess, both me and Mundungu. So that's nice. And then the last one here, I played against this, and I can't believe I can't remember whose deck this is off the top of my head.
It was I think Preston S1AL, I think, on Discord.
Oh, awesome. Sick. But this deck, I remember seeing this in an event and being like, "Oh, this is cool."
Never
But
mind,
like
Nick Tillman.
Nick Tillman,
Radis? Was it? I feel like that's wrong,
this
but I
has
could
to
be.
be no. This is right. This has to be Raidus. So
Okay, okay, I take it back.
I remember seeing this before I played against it in one of the more
Oh,
recent
never mind.
events.
This is a different. Sorry, this was a different list. I was thinking of the different Betrayer Nawada, but go ahead.
Yeah, so this is the Betrayer Nuwata with a double. It was a double Nuwata list, and I played against it as well recently. But I think this came in second or third in one of the SolForge like silver events.
Got it.
Um, and I remember looking at it being like, this looks pretty strong. But then he ended up hitting like Nuwata, like double Nuwata with a heart tree out, and then was like every time he played stuff in empty lanes, he was like gaining a ton of life, getting so much advantage. And this deck was one that like I looked at, and I'm like, I underestimated this completely. Partially because I didn't play a lot against Nuwata, but like there's a lot of just really good life gain synergy, and this gained so much, and there was so much like even like little things like the mechanizing Alamancer, and I'm pretty sure Nuwata's a mage, and like the Carnivorous Taro, he basically filled the lanes very quickly, flipped both Oak Guardians, and then was gaining even more life. And then I didn't really have a good way to deal with him because the deck that I was running that day, I think I was running like my Mad Lab or something like that. I just didn't have removal to deal with it, and then this amount of value that this like just output was insane. So this
Yeah,
deck, I like keep thinking about it, and I'm just like, this might be one of my favorite decks that I've seen in a very long time. And this
yeah.
did well against some really top meta decks. It did well in a couple events, and it's just like this shows that if you find a good fuse that pairs well, like you could potentially just take down really good events and do well.
Yep, I love Nuwada. I love Oak Guardian. I do think Oak Guardian is kind of what Fair Rumble Spark should have been, which is like, hey, you do the thing, you get this huge creature that's, and Oak Guardian's even bigger than Rumble Spark and has Breakthrough, which is even bigger, but like once it's been killed, it's been killed. So anyways, I think Oak Guardian's a ton of fun, and I love to see the list at play. And yeah, if you've never been like where they flip Oak Guardian very early and have some buffs and stuff, like it can be an absolute nightmare because it's the level 3, your dreadbolts aren't going to work, right? And it's just like, man, they keep that thing alive and I'm just dead in a couple turns.
Yes, exactly. So these were some of the decks. But that being said, this was either I think first, second, or third place decks in the events that I pulled, and I didn't pull everything because I knew that we were going to probably be tight on time. But we're hitting the hour and a half mark, and I know that's where we wanted to be. So we'll try to go through the last couple things very quickly so we could get to this final spoiler. So I think what we can do, might be a good thing, is to kind of do like a quick, very quick conclusion on like kind of where the current meta is at and where we think that like SolForge is now, and then we could go into a little bit of the key spoilers and then of stuff we've seen so far, and then go into our last spoiler here. So does that sound good to you? Because I know we're
Sounds
hitting
good. Yep. Yep.
perfect.
No, that sounds good.
So let me go back to your graphic one last time, really quick. So again, Scubatoad mentioned that he's going to post this on Discord for anyone who's interested to look at this a little bit more. And I think if you're interested in having more discussions with either myself or Scubatoad or anybody else, like always feel free to reach out. But I do think that kind of from where I played in very early SolForge Fusion through like the first worlds into the second worlds, and I know again I've been a little bit off like recently with some personal things, but I'm trying to get back into the game a little bit more. I feel like the meta has been dominated by two boogeymen for a while, and it's your Necreum Utera and your Necreum Tempest. And for me, the meta kind of still is like you could see from the event results, you could kind of see from our discussions. That's really where the meta is still sitting. Now, the type of decks you're seeing for each of these might evolve a little bit, but really, as people open more lists and they get more tuned versions of these decks, I think that that's something that like you'll see different variants, but those are really our boogeymen right now. And unless we see something really big come out of set 4, I think that that's still going to be where the meta sits. Like, do you agree with that thought?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the biggest takeaway is that it has persisted. Like life gain value was there on day one,
Yes.
right? When Alpha came out, and it has persisted through set 2 and set 3. Now, Rumble Spark came in with set 2. Recursion value has come in, but I would say these. I mean, when we looked at your tournament results, I mean, they are tiny fractions of the meta and honorable mentions, right? But life gain value, Rumble Spark have persisted through set 3. Set 3 didn't shake up the meta a whole lot. I think these are going to exist, although I think there may be, there may be at least a little bit of a silver bullet coming out against life gain value. I don't want to, I don't know if you want to just segue right into that, but from my perspective, I don't think I don't necessarily. My prediction is that it's probably not going to be enough because it still just dies to Dreadbolt, which Dreadbolt is in most of those lists, and if they save it properly. But I do think this card played off Forge right before combat with a bunch of level 3 Shamblers is gonna be painful.
Yes.
Unfortunately, they often have a lot of life, so they have some to give, and there's gonna need to be some other things. But from what I've seen from set 3, there's potentially an aggro list out there, and I think this combating the life gain, I don't know. I'm not convinced that this is going to do a ton, but I do think there might be some finely tuned lists, some things to go your way. You drop this off Forge right before Shambling combat, etc. Or they just don't have their Dreadbolt, and they're just going to die to this card.
I agree.
So I think it'll be interesting. What do you think?
So first of all, I just want to reiterate, this is the couple spoilers that we're about to talk about now are ones that are already out by other creators. And these are ones that we just want to highlight as things that could definitely make an impact on the competitive game. I remember when I heard that this one came out initially, I was like a little bit like hesitant. But then I read it again recently when we actually saw the arcs. I think this was one of the ones that was like leaked pretty early into the spoiler season. First of all, the stats on this card are pretty great. Like
Yep, agreed
3-6
there.
at level
Stats are
1.
crazy.
Yeah. The 3-6 at level 1 and the 5-8 at level 2, like they're gonna probably live. But they're
14-17?
yeah, 14-17.
What is going on there? That's
Yeah.
like, what is happening there?
Unless
with
they
that ability? Like,
Yeah.
you're not even losing much on the first two.
Yeah.
Like, anyways, I say that, but I'm also happy they pushed it because a card like this needs to be pushed for Tempest non-Rumble Spark to get in the meta.
Exactly. Like if you're playing against someone who's playing Rumble Spark and they have a Dark Heart Sorcerer out, they're gonna be like, crap, if I play a spell, I'm gonna take 15 damage. Like, can I do that? Like, can I actually take 15? And it's like, unless they have removal, like they're gonna be taking 3x the amount of life they're gaining. And against like your life gain, like Necrium Utera lists, again, unless they have removal, like the level 2 and level 3 are actually gonna make an impact. Now, granted, the level 1 is just keeps them at net neutral, but still, you gotta get past 1.
So we don't probably have time to dig into this one, but like, is there combos where there's exalts or something where like when you deal damage to a creature, like this with Reaper goes crazy, right? It gets basically like assuming they're triggering it a bunch. Like I haven't thought too much about it, but every time this trigger happens, this is dealing damage to the player, right?
Yes. That's interesting.
So, like, doesn't it have a bunch of triggers that can come off of it with something like Reaper? And I don't even know, what else that could be. But it just feels like the amount of triggers where this hits the player just could trigger a bunch of that type of effect. Which, like, I don't know, off Forge, give this. I don't know.
This card has a lot of potential, I guess is the best way to put it. Yeah, and the thing
and
is,
it's that common, which I love.
I agree. So again, I think that Stoneblades listened and realized that they needed to kind of make some adjustments to the meta, knowing how like life gain is so prevalent. And the other important thing is we know that Nova Elementals is not in this set. So like as long as you're opening this primarily in Tempest, like you're not going to have this deck and your Nova Elementalist in the same list. Because you'll never have this with a Dark Heart, you'll never have this with a Nova. So it's like people who are playing this card will be playing it in an isolated likely set for at least one card from
hyper aggressive.
Yeah, exactly.
Hyper aggressive, a lot of blasting, just trying to push damage, which is I agree. So it may I don't know. I'm skeptical that it will impact the meta, but I think with how far it's pushed and what I've seen so far, there's some potential.
Yeah, and I think if Tempest has some other really strong cards that people play, if you have this plus other good Tempest cards, like we could definitely see a potential like really big impact here. Again, because life gains like more than 50 to 60% of the meta. But we'll have to see for sure. So the next one here that we want to talk about. So there's a few cards that do this, and I think the community is pretty split on this. But this one here for Soul Harvest, really the reason why we want to talk about this is because they discard cards. I think this will probably make the biggest competitive impact so far of anything I've seen, is being able to on turn 1 forcing somebody to discard a card and you get rid of their Mantis or you get rid of their Nova Elementalist or other key cards. Like, I think this is going to be the potential of like the biggest game changer with how competitive SolForge goes moving forward, is this ability of interacting more with your opponent's hand in probably the strongest of all of the factions.
I think I am more skeptical than the community is here in terms, and I could be wrong, but I just think if you are off Forge, they've already played likely around this and dropped it onto the board ahead of it. I also think there's going to be times where you're on Forge, you play this right away, they don't have the key card. If you're not, like, what is this? You may destroy one of your creatures to play this for free. Okay, that's fine, but not great probably. look at the enemy's hand and choose a card and discard it. Like, if they don't have a key impact card, you didn't do anything for your board, and you discarded what is likely a not a suit, and they're still going to get their 2 cards. And if they either have 4 good cards in their hand or none, you are at a significant disadvantage. So I think I'm a little bit skeptical on how good these are going to play in practice, but I am willing to be wrong.
So one thing for me is the information, first of all, just looking at their hand, knowing exactly what they have can be huge. The other thing is, like, for example, let's say that you have like a couple wisps, like let's say you're playing this in either a Nuterra or a Tempest deck, even just like, let's say set 1 for like good measure. You might have ways to play spells for free. You might have creatures you're willing to sacrifice. And for me, just potentially playing this for free, getting a card out of their hand, getting information potentially of 2 plays that they could have, might drastically impact how you play your turn. Like, for me, I think this is a card that like for me, like, it's going to be, I think this is going to make a very big impact for me on how I play, at least. So I don't know how other people will see it, but like, I think the potential of keeping this on curve and getting stuff out of their hand and keeping them off of other key cards, or just the best card they have for that turn, or the answer that they might have that turn, like, I'm all for it. And I guess speaking of discard, there's another card. Again, this is on a creature. So what are your thoughts on this being a creature?
I like
versus a
this
spell?
better. I like this better because you at least have a threat on the board. Look at the enemy player's hand, choose level 1 card, discard it. So I think it's the same exact effect. I
It
didn't compare
is.
the 2.
Well, look at level 3
But like,
though.
look at the enemy player's hand and choose a card. Okay, yeah. So like, this just seems significantly better to me. I get that other one can be free, but and maybe there's some scenarios where it's good, but this one feels a lot better to me. Like, the stats here aren't bad, and the effect is significant. Again, I don't know. I could be wrong, but I still am like, if you are off Forge and they've already made their first play, I don't know if I just run this out every time, or if it's like a 5/4 and grabbing something that, like, okay, I get information for their next play, but if they've got a couple good cards in their hand, this is just a 5/4 and it's not going to impact them at all, right?
So,
So but I do think these are better in constructed than they are in limited.
oh, for sure. But I guess the thing is, though, for example, let's say your opponent has 2 cards that make you discard in their deck. Like, I'm going to be worried every play. Will they have it? Do I have to play my best card first? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's going to impact your play lines, your opponent's play lines. And then the information they get, even if they look second, like if they're off Forge and they look at their hand, like, they could get rid of the one card that either that they think that the opponent wants to play the most, or they could get rid of the piece of removal that will keep them from being able to, like, keep their key creatures on the board. I might overvalue this, but I think that, like, especially at level 3, being able to play that card for free, like, if I could ever Pipwick someone's level 3 Krogius, I think that'll be the greatest achievement that I could ever make.
Yes, I think it'll be interesting. I'm glad they printed it. I think it'll be interesting. I do think that, I mean, there are even some benefits to having cards in your discard pile.
Yes.
For certain things, where putting a card in the discard pile early is actually something they can now upgrade and play with so
That is true. That's a good point.
I think this is a lot better than the rare. I'm not convinced that a highly efficient deck is going to be that impacted by this. And at the end of the day, this is just a 5/4. Like, after it's done its thing, and it's not even taking resources away from you. All it's doing is messing with your play pattern and or cycle and or combo. But like, at the end of the day, it's not a highly statted creature, and it's only impacting your combo and sequencing. It's not actually impacting your ability to still play 2 cards.
That's true. I think that this is one that, like, one of us will come back later on. I'm not saying who it will be, where we're like, oh man, this is either more powerful than we thought or less powerful. But I'm really excited because I think it's like a very polarizing ability, which is very exciting. And I'm pretty sure
Yep.
these last 2 cards were both spoiled by Solimer, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So these are the ones that, like, I think that's really
They give
cool.
him the good stuff.
They gave
He
him
does
the
a lot
good
for the
stuff.
community,
I
so
agree.
I'll give it to him.
So then here, the reason we could go through this very quickly, we don't even need to go into the other abilities, but I think Toxis Mori, again, this is showing we have another really good Necreum Forgeborn, especially Vampiric Feast with a Forge Seal and Mantis. Like, if you have, like, for example, your Pipwick with your Soul Harvest and then other really good Necreum cards, and then you have the ability to be like, all right, now I'm going to Vampiric Feast 3 times at cycle 3, which I'm pretty sure is like 7 and 7. Like, the amount of value you could potentially get out of this with Forge Shield Mantis is pretty insane. So I know this has been posted online in the Discords, but basically being able to deal damage equal to players' attacks or creatures' attacks, or I think we could do up to 7 +7 -7 or +9 -9, like, for damage. Like, that's pretty insane. And I think this is definitely something that's going to be very strong. So again, I forget whose spoiler this was, but I think that the right Necreum list with this Forgeborn is something that could be very sought after.
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time on that one, but I agree. There's some interesting stuff I think with that one.
Yes, but Necreum continues to get the very strong Forgeborns, I guess is the thing
Yeah.
here. That might make an impact on competitive play. So here for these, the reason why we brought these up is just, again, anything free tends to be really strong. And if your deck has one of these just in it, like as the fringe 10th card, being able to play to get a free pump or a free like half epidemic, like those could be really strong. I don't think we need to focus more on that other than that, unless you have anything
Yep.
to get.
Nope. I think these are. I just like the play patterns of these. I really like it when they make you change how you sequence things, and I just like the theme dripping off of this is like, ah man, you've assembled a Necreum army. You now get this free Necreum ability. They're just cool designs. I'm glad they exist.
I agree with you 100%. And this last one, the reason why we brought this up. So first thing, I actually read this card and I wrote it off until I read it again and was like, if it has Defender, destroy it. So it's like basically this removes your Dark Heart. So if you have a deck where you're thinking that Rumble Spark's going to be in the meta, you care a lot about removing Dark Heart. And even though this only deals 4 damage at level 1, it deals 6 at level 2 and 8 at level 3. No matter what, at any level, whether or not it's level gated or it's not level gated, it will just kill a Dark Heart or any other creature with Defender that you worry about. So what are your thoughts on this one?
I think this being at common and Pyrax being at common means that you are often going to see an Ice Torrent and Pyrax deck. And I think that just alone is a solid start to combating some of the life gain stuff that's happening with Darkforge, Darkheart Sorcerer, and just the life gain shenanigans. So I just think the fact that both of these are at common, you're often going to see an Ice Torrent Pyrax deck, and that's going to be a decent start to combating the meta. You find a highly tuned list, and you're off to the races on whether you can actually make an impact and actually have a silver bullet for those decks.
Yeah. So then what I will say is before we get into our last spoiler, because we have one more and I know people have been hanging out for a while, while we still got people on the line, I want you to plug your website one more time. I'll let you do it so I don't do it. The website and your sales. So if you want to quickly do that. So we have Scubatoad with me again for anyone who's joined in a little bit later. So yeah, if you want to plug all your stuff that you got, I would appreciate that.
I'll plug it real quick. So we run GreatVikingGames.com. Well, actually, the .com is actually for a different game, but we have that brand. It's the same people that do the infrastructure to support the sales. We try to run a sale every month. So if you see us, we have roughly 6,000 decks that we add to and price monthly that you can go out and actually try to get decks that are great fuses for the combinations that you're trying to make. So come to the marketplace in the Discord. If you see this, that's where we host our sales. And then the other site I run is SolForgeFusionDecks.com, which is where we use the same backend to price our decks that we use to actually evaluate the decks. We offer that up on the website, SolForgeFusionDecks.com, for the community. That's really just a passion project that I've done because a lot of people ask me to run their collections through our algorithm to evaluate their decks. So if you've ever opened up your collection and thought, I don't know where to start, that's a great way to go upload your list. Actually, you don't even have to upload. You just put in your username and you get our evaluations on your decks. So those are the two things that I do for the community, and would be great to see more people participate with them.
Yeah, and then one thing I want to say as well is one of the reasons why I want to make sure that I had this discussion with Scubatoad. So first of all, amazing player of the game. Like every time I played against him, they've always been very competitive games. But what he has done for the competitive scene for SolForge is probably one of the biggest impacts of anyone that's been part of this game and part of this community. So by doing Great Viking Games and having the deck sales, he allowed for this competitive community to grow. Because otherwise, you would have people like myself or Namrog who all have thousands of decks who would have basically a selection of everything while other people might have whatever they've opened. But basically, Scubatoad and Great Viking Games have allowed for people to actually be able to get decks that they feel like could fuse well. So they've opened a ton of stuff. They've sold to the community. They've fostered the competitive scene. I know I've gotten like decks that I've used in world events and things like that from Great Viking Games, and they're really like Scubatoad's one of the biggest pillars of this community. And I wanted to make sure that as we were talking about the competitive scene, that we really got to highlight everything that he's done for the community, for this game. And it just, we wouldn't be where we are today without him and without his company. So thank you for everything you do, Scubatoad.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So with that, so we're about to get into our last spoiler. So thank you everybody for tuning in. So I will let you do the reading for this one because I read the last one. So let's get to the next spoiler. So it's all you.
Okay, so we talked about this one earlier. Deal 5 damage to an enemy creature. If it's augmented, deal 10 damage. I think my initial reaction was disintegrate or ish. Disintegrate, like similar, fits that spot in the deck algorithm. Dealing 5 damage to a creature. It is an enemy creature, so there's not shenanigans that you can do with this. It's, I think, Spark. What's the Spark?
Lightning Spark.
Lightning Spark is deal 5 damage to anything. So I think this is only to a creature. So I don't know where this fits in terms of where I think. I think in my head I pretty much slot this into disintegrate. I think augmented creatures are gonna be out there, and I think often they buff the creature. So I think that is gonna be relevant. What about you?
I agree. So my first thought looking at this was I immediately thought to Lightning Spark, and I looked it up and I'm like, okay, 5 damage, but it's not to the player. But knowing that Augment is going to be a big ability in this set, I think that it's very valid to be like, you know what? I could deal 5 damage to anything, but if I'm playing against a set 4 list, I could deal 10. I think in sealed, this is going to be an all-star at level 1. It's something that you could leave under leveled. It can't kill like a bunch of key cards. Like it can't kill a Rumble Spark. It can't kill a Dark Heart because it doesn't have that 8 damage threshold. But something like Disintegrate requires them to have the creature already out on the field, where this can kill anything and deal any damage. So it's like I feel like the trade-off of not hitting a player, it's a little disappointing for the sake of like, hey, this is a removal that I have that can't do more. That being said, though, it beats a lot of other cards that could only deal 4 damage. So it's like it's a pretty big break point, and I think that a lot of the spoilers that we looked at as key items, as well as the Esslin Northwind, all had 5 health at level 1. So this might be something where they intentionally picked this for sealed, and I think this is a very good level 1 piece of removal for sealed.
My
So
only my only concern for this is I do think this weakens the overall set for against prior sets because there's
yeah,
not going to be as much augmentation with some of these life gain old set one and life gain effects, and I do feel like well to get maximum value out of this, like hey, deal 5 is not going to be enough to kill that shambling demon or whatever it is, right? And it's like well, it's not augmented because augments aren't in those sets. And so I do think some of the value printed on this card is going to be great when you're facing other set 4 decks. But if you're facing, if this is in a highly tuned list and you're in a competitive event facing, initial Utera Necrium life gain, they don't have any augments, this is a bit of a weakness here.
yes, exactly. So as Radius mentioned in the chat, it's basically the anti-new mechanic card, the anti-augment removal, basically.
Sure. Yep.
So let's get to level 2.
Yeah, I mean these scale deal 8. Deal 8 still to a creature. If it's augmented, deal 16. I mean, that's a crazy amount of damage. I'm trying to think if there's any way that amount of damage can be abused, like I don't know, breakthrough spell damage or something. I think that's a mechanic in SolForge, although I can't think of any of the cards off the top of my head. Maybe it's not. So, anyways, I think still it scales fine. 8 at level 2 is a little light. You're not going to be able to remove everything there. Obviously, if it's augmented, you pretty much are removing anything. But this is a little light for, I think, 8 at level 2 is a little light.
I agree. And I agree with everything you're saying here. So let's go right to level 3.
And so 12 and then 24. Again, if the 24 can be abused somehow, great that you can snipe these massive augmented creatures. 12 is light. Like if this is needed to be spot premium removal, 12 is not often going to cut it.
I agree. And the thing is, at least it's common and it's not rare. So but again, this is something that means you'll see in a lot of decks. And
yeah, I mean, I guess I shouldn't. I mean, 12. It's solid removal, but I would say this is not premium removal.
no, it's definitely not premium, but it's very good for again the sealed and limited formats where it's like if there was like a set 4 constructed, this is probably a much higher tier than if you're playing against set 1 decks. Um, and I think it was let's see, someone I just saw in the chat, and who was it? I think Go Hortner. So I think that's Traveler. Basically said it would be better if new sets try to counter old sets instead of themselves. So obviously, I think that every new set's going to have cards that will deal with their mechanics. But I do agree that with the power level of set 1, and I think it's been like very well spoken that like set 1 life gain and a little bit of set 2 life gain were like so high tier, and they realized how strong it was after both sets were play tested and basically ready for print. Definitely, it's good to see some life gain like countering with this new set with some of the spoilers that we've seen. But definitely, I feel like the breakpoint's not high enough for these to like really want this in your deck. But at least if this ends up being the 10th card and it's a piece of removal, at least it's removal. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Disintegrate is what, 8, 16, 24? And I know it has the caveat of had to enter that turn, but at least it deals with pretty much anything. I almost wish that the augment here was just free. I feel like the
Yes.
augment it's yes, you kill that thing, but they lowered the amount of damage to where it's not gonna take out a Dark Heart at level 3. It's only 12. And that's 15. And it's a big difference. And it's just light enough where I wish it was like, hey, I wish it was 6, 10, 16 on its own. And then, yeah, you still have the crazy amount for augmented because, in set 3, you're going to see it, but not maybe as much in the constructed ladder play. So I feel like it's a little light and it's going to hurt set 3 Tempest decks a little bit against some of the earlier sets. But obviously, if set 3 augment stuff is running out of hand in the constructed and obviously limited, then it's going to be great premium removal.
I agree. So basically, I know we said an hour and a half, and we're at an hour and 54 minutes, so we should definitely wrap up now. But basically, thank you everybody who tuned in. This was a lot of fun to talk about kind of the state of the SolForge competitive meta, where we think some of these spoilers will be. And again, it's always amazing to have these discussions with Scubatoad. So basically, anyone who is interested in seeing any of our resources, you can either reach out to us directly. I'm pretty sure that at least I'm going to post the Excel sheet that I had up, as well as like some of the as well as the spoilers themselves out on the Discord. And Scubatoad, I think you said you were going to be posting that spreadsheet or the PowerPoint chart up as well.
Yeah, I'll throw it up there. I am curious on because I mean, I am sure we didn't get it all right. I'm sure the community has some feedback. I'd just be interested to hear their community feedback. I also want to shout out to Sam here. He put this all together. He grabbed all these images. He did the analysis. He did a ton of production work to make sure that this was at least content that could be reviewed at a later point in time, or for anyone viewing this. And I just want to make sure you call out his prep work for this episode and what he did to actually, set it up in OBS, because I don't know how to do all this stuff. So I would say just make sure whatever you can do to support him, jam the like button, follow button, make sure you've done that for him on his site, because this was a lot of work for him to put together.
Thank you. And I will say I was inspired by it, because like you put that chart together right when we were starting to go, and I'm like, all right, we're going to go deep today. So that's where it was like basically the two of us kind of working together made this happen. And again, anyone, like as Scubatoad said, if you like, so I'll be posting this both on YouTube as well as the replays usually stick on Twitch for a while. But either on the Discord or on the YouTube, whatever makes the most sense. We'd love to hear what other people think. So like if other people have a different view of the meta, if other people think that there's other boogeymen, or if there's like a deck that we didn't talk about that people think is like a really cool one that someone brewed out. So I know, like, for example, like Carl Testa or Gambit 184 has been doing a lot of really cool brews that people have been really seeing and enjoying. Like if there's anyone like that, like we'd love to see some of the cool brews that people think are kind of maybe have the potential to upset the meta. And then we'd love to see what people start brewing as set 4 comes out. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Once again, thank you Scubatoad for taking the time here. And yeah, so please everybody make sure you buy decks from Grey Viking Games, and like hopefully he'll keep continue. Well, I know that Scubatoad will continue to keep supporting the community like he has been. And again, thank you for being such a pillar to SolForge and to our community. So with that, do you have anything any last stuff that you want to say?
I don't. Nope. Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. I would do this just for funsies, because I just enjoy the game and the community.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have to do this again, like in like 6 months or a year, or not a year, but in 6 months we'll have to revisit and be like, so what the Nathas and Scubatoad thought in the next 6 months or whatever. So maybe we'll have to revisit this. But thanks again. I hope everybody has a great night. All right. See ya.